I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The whole idea was simple. I wanted to get away from everything for a while: work, noise, the city, and the constant pull of people and schedules. I had found a cabin listed online, far out in the woods near a lake. It wasn't the kind of polished place you'd see in a travel brochure. It looked old, a little rough, but it had the basic things I wanted: 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and distance from anyone else. That was the most important thing to me: distance. The drive out took nearly 6 hours, the last 2 on narrow dirt roads that wound through thick pine forest. The further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No other cars, no houses, just the occasional old trailhead sign or weathered mailbox standing alone in the brush. When I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because I had reached the place I'd been planning for, and unease because it really was as remote as it had looked online. The trees crowded close around the clearing, tall and silent. The air smelled damp and heavy, like moss and pine sap. The cabin itself looked smaller than I had imagined. The wood was darkened from age and weather, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and one of the shutters hung at an angle. The porch steps creaked as I carried my bags up. Inside it was even more basic: 1 room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed against the far wall. The only other space was a tiny bathroom with an old toilet that I wasn't sure even worked properly. I spent the first couple hours unloading my gear from the car and setting things up inside. I had brought a cooler with food, a lantern, extra blankets, and some tools. I stacked firewood by the stove and double-checked the locks on the windows and door. The place didn't feel unsafe exactly, but it had that strange quiet that presses down on you when you're far from other people. No hum of traffic, no voices, not even the distant sound of a plane. Just the rustle of the trees outside and the occasional call of a bird. By late afternoon, I walked down to the lake. It was about a 10-minute trail through the woods, the ground soft with pine needles. The water was calm, dark, and still. I stood on the shore for a long while, just listening. I felt a sense of being watched, though I knew that was just my nerves adjusting to being alone out there. I skimmed a few stones, then went back to the cabin before dark. That first night, I sat at the table eating from a can of chili, the lantern casting shadows against the log walls. The silence grew heavier after the sun went down. I kept glancing at the windows even though I had shut the curtains. The stove crackled, but every small creak of the wood or gust of wind against the cabin made me jump. I tried to read but couldn't focus. Finally, I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tight around me. The night dragged on. I heard noises outside, faint but sharp in the stillness. Branches snapping, something moving through the underbrush. My mind jumped to deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, but the longer I lay there, the less convinced I felt. It wasn't constant movement, just single noises every now and then, as if something stopped and listened, then moved again. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, everything looked normal. Sunlight came through the cracks in the curtains, birds chirped outside, and the unease I'd felt at night seemed almost silly. I went for a hike deeper into the woods, following a rough trail marked by faded blazes on the trees. The forest was dense, the air cool even though it was summer. After an hour, I came across an old fire ring, blackened stones arranged in a circle. It looked like no one had used it in years. Nearby, I found a rusted tin can and a broken folding chair half buried in the dirt. I kept walking until the trail thinned out. At one point, I thought I saw movement ahead, but it was just a deer darting away through the trees. Eventually, I turned back. On the way, I noticed something odd near the fire ring that I had missed before. The ground had a patch of earth that looked disturbed, as if someone had recently dug there and then tried to cover it back up. The soil was darker and softer than the ground around it. I crouched down, ran my fingers through the dirt, then quickly stood back up. Something about it felt wrong. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling. I made coffee on a small camping stove I'd brought, sat on the porch and watched the trees sway. But my mind kept going back to that patch of disturbed earth. Why would someone dig out there, miles from anything, and then leave it half covered? That night, I heard noises again. This time, they were closer. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound that made my blood run cold. The crunch of footsteps on the gravel just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough that it wasn't an animal. I held my breath, every muscle in my body stiff. The footsteps moved around the cabin, pausing near the windows. I lay there frozen, terrified that whoever it was could hear my breathing. After what felt like forever, the footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept staring at the door, the lantern lit on the table, waiting for something else to happen. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. There, clear as anything, were footprints in the dirt and pine needles. They were boot prints, not animal tracks, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, then heading back into the forest. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I was completely alone, miles from the nearest house, and someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it might have been a hunter or someone hiking through the woods, but deep down I didn't believe that. Whoever it was had come close enough to look inside. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for movement. At one point, I thought I saw something far off through the trees, like the shape of a person standing still. When I blinked, it was gone. That evening, I debated whether to pack up and leave, but part of me stubbornly wanted to stay. I told myself I was being paranoid, that whoever it was probably had no interest in me. I locked the door, barred it with a chair, and kept the lantern on low while I lay in bed. The noises returned after midnight. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of someone trying the door handle, slow and careful, as if testing to see if it was locked. I sat upright in bed, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The handle rattled quietly, then stopped. Silence followed, stretching out so long that I almost thought I imagined it. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps again, circling the cabin. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I lay awake until dawn, then packed up quickly, shoving everything into bags without much care. When I stepped outside, the woods were calm and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The boot prints from the night before were fresh again, circling the cabin. They hadn't come from the road. They came straight out of the forest. I loaded everything into the car, my hands shaking, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the clearing, I looked back one last time. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the far edge of the clearing, just at the tree line, stood a figure. They were too far away to make out clearly, but I could see the shape of a person, motionless, watching me leave. I pressed the gas harder and didn't stop until I was miles down the dirt road, dust billowing behind me. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the main road and the first sign of another car, the relief was overwhelming. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. I never told anyone the full details, just that the cabin wasn't what I expected. I never went back to that area again, and I never will. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape, but what I found there was something else entirely. Whoever was out there watching the cabin at night wasn't passing through by accident. They knew I was alone. They came close enough to touch the windows. And the thought that keeps me awake some nights is this: if I hadn't locked the door, if I hadn't been awake to hear it, maybe they would have tried harder to come inside. I had planned this camping trip for months, and by the time I finally packed my gear and loaded it into my car, I was more than ready to be alone in the woods for a few days. I wanted quiet. I wanted the kind of silence that only comes when you're miles away from traffic, phones, and people. I had been working long hours for weeks, staring at computer screens, and by the end of it, I felt like my head was buzzing. Camping felt like the only way to reset myself. I drove out early in the morning, following a rough 2-lane road that wound up through the hills. The farther I went, the less I saw of people. The houses thinned out until there were none. The last gas station disappeared behind me, and soon there was nothing but forest on both sides of me. The air even felt different the moment I stepped out at a small pull-off area where the trail began. It was sharp, clean, and heavy with pine. The pack on my back was heavy, but it felt good to walk with it. The dirt path was narrow and wound through tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I hiked for hours, stopping once to rest by a small stream where I filled my bottle with cold water. I didn't see a single person out there, and by the time I found a clearing where I wanted to set up camp, I was sweating and aching in that good, tired way. The clearing was small and looked like it had been used before. There was a ring of stones where someone had built a fire at some point, and there were flat patches of dirt perfect for a tent. I dropped my pack and stood there for a while, just listening. The woods made noise, but it was different from the noise back in town. There were birds, the occasional rustle of leaves when wind pushed through, and the creak of tree branches. That was all. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. I set up my tent, staked it down firmly, and rolled out my sleeping bag inside. The afternoon light was fading, so I gathered wood from the edges of the clearing. It was dry enough to burn, and when I got a fire going, the glow of it made me feel safer than I expected. Fire cuts into the dark in a way that makes you think nothing can get close without you seeing it. I ate some food I'd packed, simple things, trail mix and dried meat, and sat by the fire until the sun was gone. The woods turned black fast. It was a deep black, the kind you don't see in places where there are streetlights or houses around. I sat close to the fire and kept it going, just watching the flames climb and fall. The silence settled even harder now. The birds had gone quiet, and the only sound was the crackling of the wood. It was around then that I first thought of the word demon, not in the supernatural sense, not as in some monster with horns and fire in its mouth. I thought of it in the way people sometimes use it to describe something inside them, something they wrestle with. Personal demon. I don't know why it popped into my head right then. Maybe because the woods had this strange way of making me feel like I wasn't just out there with trees and animals. It was like I had dragged all my thoughts with me, and with nothing to distract me, they felt louder. I tried to ignore it and went into the tent when the fire started to die. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon walls, listening to the little night sounds outside. Every pop of wood, every brush of wind on the trees felt sharp in the silence. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. My mind kept racing. I thought about work, about the people I'd left behind for the weekend, about mistakes I'd made years ago that still sometimes dug into me when I was alone. It was like the quiet had pulled all those thoughts out of me and put them right in front of me, where I couldn't avoid them. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard movement outside. It wasn't just the wind or the creak of a branch. It was footsteps, slow and careful, crunching on leaves near the edge of the clearing. I froze in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. My first thought was animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, but the steps were too controlled. They paused now and then continued, like someone was circling just outside. I sat up and unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out. The fire was only glowing embers now, barely enough light to see. The clearing looked empty. The trees around it were tall and black, swaying slightly in the breeze. I didn't see anything moving, but I knew what I had heard. I stayed there, half out of the tent, staring into the woods until my eyes burned. Finally, I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods could play tricks on you when you were alone. I zipped the tent back up, lay down again, and eventually drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff and groggy. When I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt, just beyond the fire pit, were footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, pressed deep into the soil, circling around where I had been sitting last night. They went halfway around the clearing and then disappeared into the trees. I crouched down, staring at them, and for a long moment I felt like the air was sucked out of my chest. My mind raced with explanations. A hiker passing through, a hunter, someone curious. But the way the prints circled, stopping close to my tent, made my skin crawl. Whoever it was had stood there, watching me. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I had hiked so far in. The sun was bright now, and the woods looked less threatening. I convinced myself it was nothing, just someone passing through who had kept their distance. I spent the day hiking farther up the trail, leaving my tent set up in the clearing. I carried only a small pack with water and food, but the whole time I was out there I felt uneasy. Every snapping twig made me spin around, scanning the trees. When I returned to camp that evening, everything looked the same. My tent was still there, untouched. The fire pit was as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I built the fire larger, feeding it until the flames were tall and strong. I sat close to it, staring into the dark woods, waiting for movement. Hours passed. The fire burned down. I started to feel foolish, like I was working myself up for no reason. But then, when I finally crawled into the tent, I heard it again. The slow steps circling closer this time, leaves crunching, twigs snapping. Whoever it was, they were careful but not careful enough to be silent. My chest tightened, and my hands shook as I reached for the small hatchet I had brought. I held it in the dark, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. The steps came closer, stopping just outside the thin nylon of the tent. I could hear breathing now, heavy, steady breathing. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Minutes passed like hours, and then the breathing slowly faded. The steps moved away into the trees. When morning came, I stepped outside and saw the prints again, circling closer to the tent this time. I followed them a short distance into the woods, but they vanished into the undergrowth. By then, I knew this wasn't just someone passing by. Whoever it was, they were out there watching me, following me, waiting. I thought again of that word, demon. Not something with horns or fire, but the kind of demon that lives in people. The kind that makes them do things, cruel things. I didn't stay another night. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat, and hiked back the way I had come. The entire time, I felt eyes on me, just beyond the trees. Once or twice, I heard footsteps behind me, far off, but close enough to know I wasn't alone. When I finally saw my car at the trailhead, my legs almost gave out from relief. I threw my pack into the back seat and drove without looking back. Even now, thinking about it, I know what I felt out there wasn't the woods playing tricks. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a hiker. It was someone with patience. Someone who had found me alone miles from help and decided to circle me like prey. That was the demon I met in those woods. Not a monster from a story, but a person with no reason and no mercy. I'll never know what they wanted, but I know if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks, telling myself I needed time away from the noise of the city, the traffic, the constant rush of people around me, and the dull rhythm of my routine. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and I wanted to feel the kind of silence that only the woods can give. I had gone camping before, but always in busier campgrounds, never this far out. This time I chose a more remote place, somewhere I had read about online where not many people go because it's a little harder to get to. That was what appealed to me. The thought of setting up camp miles away from anyone else gave me a strange mix of excitement and nerves. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, matches, a small knife, and a first aid kit. I made sure I had enough to last a few days. The drive out there took almost 4 hours. By the time I turned off the main road onto the narrow dirt trail, I had already lost cell service. I felt a strange pull in my stomach at that moment, a reminder that once I got out there, I would be on my own. The dirt trail stretched out into the woods, uneven and full of dips and stones. My old car rattled the whole way, and at times I thought maybe it wasn't a great idea to drive so far in. But I kept going until I found a clearing big enough to park and unload. I killed the engine, stepped out, and the sudden quiet of the forest hit me. No humming cars, no voices, no faint music from somewhere down the block. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional bird calling, and the crunch of my boots on dirt. It was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. I walked around the clearing and decided where to pitch the tent. I picked a spot close to the tree line, not too far from where the car was parked, and spent a while setting it up. It always takes me longer than I expect, trying to line up the poles, stretch the fabric tight, and hammer the stakes into the ground. By the time the tent was standing, I was already sweating even though the air wasn't that hot. I unrolled the sleeping bag inside, arranged my things neatly, and then sat down on a fallen log to drink some water. The sun was still high, but I noticed how much darker it seemed under the thick trees. Even in the middle of the day, the shadows felt heavy, like they were swallowing the light. I decided to walk a little, not too far, just to get a sense of where I was. I followed a faint trail that led deeper into the woods. The ground was soft and covered with pine needles, and the air smelled strong of earth and sap. I walked maybe 15 minutes before I stopped and turned around. I didn't want to go too far without marking anything, and I wasn't carrying my backpack. As I walked back, I thought about how easy it would be to get turned around in a place like this. Every tree looked like the last, every stretch of the trail felt the same. I made a mental note to be careful to not wander off too far, especially as it got later. When I got back, I started gathering wood for a fire. It felt good to have something to do with my hands, snapping branches, stacking them, and preparing a small fire pit with stones. The fire caught easily with the dry sticks, and soon I had a steady flame. I cooked a small meal over it, nothing fancy, just something simple to fill my stomach. Eating out there felt different, slower, quieter. I chewed and listened to the sounds around me, the fire cracking, the distant tap of woodpeckers, the wind stirring the trees. I didn't see another person, not a single sign of anyone else nearby. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. As the sun dropped lower, the woods changed. The light that filtered through the trees grew dimmer, colder, and the shadows stretched long. I knew I should gather more wood before it got too dark, so I set out again, breaking branches and carrying them back in armfuls. When I returned, I noticed how quickly the temperature was falling. The warm air of the afternoon was gone, and the cool night air was settling in. I fed the fire and sat close, warming my hands, listening to the forest grow quieter. The birds that had been chirping earlier were silent now. A different set of sounds took over. The distant call of what I thought was an owl, the rustling of something small in the underbrush, the faint groan of the trees shifting with the wind. When full darkness came, I felt a weight settle over the clearing. The kind of darkness out there was different from anything in the city. It was thick, almost solid, pressing in on all sides, broken only by the glow of the fire and the small beam of my flashlight. Sitting there, I felt both safe and exposed at the same time. The fire gave me comfort, but it also made me feel like I was lit up while everything else was hidden. I couldn't see past the tree line. Anything could be out there and I wouldn't know. I told myself not to overthink it. I cleaned up my little cooking area, made sure the fire was stable, and crawled into the tent. Lying down on the sleeping bag, I felt the ground pressing up against my back. The sounds outside seemed louder when I was inside, muffled but constant. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves stood out. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself it was just animals, nothing more. After a while, I drifted off. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but it was still dark. The fire had died down outside, and the tent was filled with shadows. I lay still, listening. At first I thought it was silence, but then I heard it. A faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. Not the quick scurry of a small animal. Something heavier. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps grew closer, circling, stopping, then starting again. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to believe it was just a deer, but the sound was too controlled, too cautious. It wasn't wandering, it was moving with purpose. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or shine the flashlight. I just lay there, staring at the fabric above me, waiting. After what felt like forever, the steps faded. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the silence creep back in, until exhaustion pulled me under again. When morning came, the clearing looked the same as it had before, calm and ordinary. The fire was just ash and smoke. I stepped out of the tent and walked the edge of the clearing. That was when I saw it. Muddy boot prints in the soft ground, not mine, circling close to the tent and stopping just a few feet away. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there in the night, standing close, watching. I stared at the prints, following them as they led back toward the trees. They disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the undergrowth. I packed quickly that morning, stuffing things into the backpack without the careful order I usually kept. My hands shook as I rolled the tent. Every sound in the forest felt sharper now. Every crack of a branch made me look over my shoulder. I carried everything to the car and loaded it fast, my eyes flicking to the tree line again and again. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, the relief that washed over me was almost enough to choke me. The engine rumbled, and I backed out of the clearing. The dirt trail was rough, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. As the forest thinned and the road widened, the knot in my stomach loosened little by little. I kept thinking about the boot prints, how close they had come to where I slept. I would never know who it was or what they wanted, and maybe that was worse than knowing. The woods had given me the silence I thought I wanted, but it also reminded me how vulnerable you really are when you're alone out there. I haven't gone camping since. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the cars and people and constant ringing of my phone. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, not in a popular campground with other families and campers, but a quiet place I found after looking at maps and hiking trails. I wanted to be alone, far from anyone. I packed food, water, my tent, sleeping bag, small stove, a flashlight, and everything else I thought I might need. The hike to the site was not easy. The trail was narrow and uneven, with rocks sticking out and tree roots twisting across the ground. My backpack felt heavier with every step. Sweat soaked through my shirt as the sun pressed down from above, shining through the leaves in broken pieces. Birds called out, and every now and then I heard the scurry of something small moving through the brush. I liked the sound of the forest, though. It was a different kind of noise than the city, softer but always there. By the time I reached the spot I had picked, I was tired. The place was open enough for a tent, but surrounded by thick trees on every side. The ground was flat, and I could hear a creek nearby. That made me feel better, because water meant I could clean myself and refill what I had brought. I dropped my pack and sat on a log, catching my breath before setting up camp. I spent the rest of the afternoon putting up my tent, gathering some wood for a fire, and setting up my little cooking area. The air smelled of dirt, pine, and leaves. When I sat down to eat my first meal, it felt peaceful. The forest grew quieter as the sun lowered, and by the time darkness fell, I could only hear the sound of insects and the occasional splash from the creek. I crawled into my tent that night feeling tired but calm. I lay on my back, staring up at the thin fabric above me, listening to the night. It was strange being out there alone, with no houses, no streetlights, and no one to talk to. But it was what I wanted. I let myself relax, and eventually sleep pulled me under. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay very still, listening. The forest was not silent. I could hear the chirp of crickets, the faint rush of water from the creek, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then I caught something else, a sound I hadn't heard earlier. It was the sound of movement, slow, careful movement. Something was walking near my tent. I held my breath. The steps were not heavy, but they weren't light either. They crunched softly on the dry leaves and twigs outside. My first thought was deer, but the steps were too deliberate, too close. They circled around, stopping at times, then continuing again. My heart began to pound, and I strained my ears. I wished I had a window in my tent, but all I had was the thin wall of fabric separating me from whatever was outside. Then I heard it, a low sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It was the sound of a dog. I froze. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it at first, But then it came again, clearer this time. A short huff followed by a soft growl. My skin prickled. I pictured a stray dog, wandering deep into the forest, hungry and wild. Maybe it had caught my scent, or maybe it had been drawn by the smell of the food I had cooked earlier. The steps came closer. They stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the breathing now, heavy and steady. A nose pressed against the fabric, sniffing. The tent wall shifted slightly as if pushed. I felt trapped, lying there in the dark, unable to see. The dog moved slowly around the tent, sniffing and breathing. I didn't dare move. My flashlight was within reach, but I was afraid to turn it on. Any sudden noise or light might make the dog more aggressive. Minutes stretched long. I thought maybe it would leave, but it didn't. The sniffing turned into scratching. The dog's paw scraped at the side of my tent, testing it. My chest tightened as I imagined it tearing through the thin fabric and lunging at me. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then I heard the sound of tearing into the plastic bag where I had stored my food outside. I realized too late that I should have hung it high in a tree. Now the dog was into it, ripping it apart, eating whatever it could find. I listened to the crunch of wrappers and the sound of chewing. I lay there, helpless, while my food supply was destroyed. Anger mixed with fear inside me. I couldn't survive the days I had planned without that food. But I couldn't go out there, not with a wild dog feeding just feet from me. After what felt like forever, the chewing slowed. The dog circled the tent once more, sniffing again, before walking off into the night. I waited long after the sounds faded before I allowed myself to breathe normally again. My stomach was tight with fear, but exhaustion eventually pulled me back to sleep. When morning came, I stepped out carefully. The camp was a mess. The bag that had held my food was shredded. Empty wrappers were scattered on the ground. Some of my supplies were chewed and useless. The dirt was marked with paw prints. They were large, not like the prints of a small dog. I felt uneasy all day. Every sound in the forest made me turn my head, expecting to see the animal again. I tried to go on with my day, fetching water, cleaning up the site, checking what food I had left. But the thought of that dog lingered. It wasn't just a passing animal. It had come right up to me, sniffed at the tent, tested the walls, knew I was there. That night, I tried to prepare better. I cleaned the site, burned trash in the fire, and made sure nothing smelled too strong. I even considered hiking back, but the trail was long, and I thought maybe it was just a one-time encounter. Maybe the dog would not return. But when night fell, I felt the same tightness in my chest. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay awake listening. Hours passed. The forest grew quiet. Then I heard it again, the soft crunch of paws on leaves. This time, I didn't freeze right away. I grabbed my flashlight and held it in my hand. Ready. The steps drew closer. I could hear breathing again, heavy, steady, close. Then the sniffing at the tent wall started. The nose pressed against the fabric, moving along slowly. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the wall. The light shined through the thin fabric, casting a glow outside. For a second, I saw the shadow of a large head, ears pointed, muzzle long. The dog jerked back, startled by the light, but it didn't run. It circled the tent, growling softly, the sound vibrating through the night air. I sat up, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The dog scratched at the side of the tent again, more aggressive this time. My fear turned into a kind of cold focus. I grabbed the metal cooking pot I had kept near the door and banged it hard with my flashlight. The noise was loud, echoing in the forest. The growling stopped. I banged again. Then I heard the steps moving away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat upright, listening, gripping the flashlight, waiting for it to come back. Didn't. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Couldn't stay there. The dog knew where I was. It wasn't afraid to come close. If I stayed, it might not just stop at food the next time. It might come through the tent. I packed quickly, not bothering to eat. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it watching me from the trees. The hike back felt longer than before. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like movement. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting, I felt the first real relief in 2 days. I threw my pack inside and locked the doors. Sitting behind the wheel, I let myself breathe. The trip was over. I had wanted peace, but I had found something else. I had found what it was like to be prey, to lie helpless in the dark while something with teeth and hunger circled just outside. The dog was not a ghost or a monster. It was real, alive, and dangerous, and it had reminded me that out there, in the quiet woods, I was not in control. I drove home with the image of that shadow on my tent burned into my mind. I knew I wouldn't forget the sound of its breathing, the scratch of its claws, or the weight of its presence outside the thin wall that had barely separated me from it. I always liked camping more than most people I knew. I enjoyed the quiet, the slow rhythm of the woods, and the way the night felt so different when you were miles away from the noise of cars and cities. But sometimes when I think back on the trips I've taken, there is one trip that doesn't leave my mind. It isn't because of the view or the place itself, but because of what happened there, and every time I close my eyes at night, I still see parts of it clearly, as if I'm still lying in that tent with nothing but thin fabric between me and what was outside. It was late summer when I decided to go on that trip. The heat during the day was heavy, but at night it cooled down enough to make sleeping outside almost perfect. I wanted to spend 3 days alone in the woods, to hike, fish, and just sit by a fire without thinking about work or phones. I packed everything carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, and bear spray. I had read enough about camping to know bears were always a risk in that area, but I thought as long as I kept my food sealed and away from camp, I'd be fine. The place I picked was a forest near a river, about a 2-hour hike from the trailhead. It wasn't a popular site, and that was what I liked about it. When I got there, I felt like I had the whole world to myself. The river made a soft sound, steady and calm, and the trees stood so tall that when the wind moved through them, it was like a low whistle. I set up my tent on flat ground close enough to the river that I could hear it, but far enough that I wasn't in danger of flooding if it rained. The first day went quietly. I walked the trail, gathered some wood, and cooked a small meal before lying back to watch the sky turn from orange to dark blue. The first night was peaceful. I slept with only a little unease that comes naturally when you're alone in the woods, every crack of a branch making you shift awake for a second before you let it fade. Nothing disturbed me deeply that night, and when I woke in the morning, the sun was already lighting the treetops. I boiled water, made coffee, and decided to spend the day walking further along the river to see if I could catch fish. The second day was warmer. The sun pressed down hard, and I felt the sweat run across my back as I walked along the bank. I caught 2 small fish and kept them for dinner. I knew cooking fish near camp wasn't the best idea when bears were around, but I didn't want to carry them too far. I cleaned them down by the water, washed my hands, and wrapped them up until I was ready to cook later. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but content. I made a small fire and set the fish over it, the smell drifting into the air. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet, and then put out the fire carefully, making sure no sparks remained. The evening settled in quickly, and before I knew it, the woods were covered in shadow. I sat a little while longer, listening to the water, until the coolness of night made me retreat into the tent. That was when the change began. It was maybe around midnight when I first woke up. A sound outside my tent pulled me out of sleep. It wasn't the light snaps of twigs I had heard the night before, but something heavier, slower. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, crunch, crunch, like weight pressing into the ground. I felt my skin crawl. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe even just branches falling. But in the silence that followed, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, and heavy. I froze inside my sleeping bag, every muscle locked. The breathing moved around the tent, low to the ground at first, then higher, then back again. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I knew if I unzipped it even a little, whatever was out there would notice. I could hear the snuffling now, a wet, rough sound as if something was pushing its nose against things, smelling, searching. My mind raced. Bear. The word sat heavy inside me. I stayed still for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The sound eventually drifted away, the crunching fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay awake, ears straining for anything that might return. When the first light of dawn broke through the thin fabric of the tent, I finally sat up, my body stiff and tense. Outside, I checked the ground. The soil was soft near the camp, and I saw prints. Big, round, heavy prints. There was no mistaking them. A bear had been at my tent. My stomach tightened. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I convinced myself maybe it had just passed through. Maybe it wouldn't return. The third day felt different. Every sound made me turn my head. The woods that had felt calm and open before now seemed to close in around me. I walked less and stayed closer to camp. I ate some of the dry food I had packed instead of cooking again. I tried to keep busy, gathering water, writing a few notes in my journal, but always my ears stayed open, waiting. As the evening came, I faced the decision of what to do. The trail back to the car would take hours, and I didn't want to walk it in the dark. I told myself one more night, then I'd leave early in the morning. I set up my camp as neatly as I could, made sure no food was near the tent, and zipped myself inside when the sky turned black. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle, every snap of wood outside made my heart pound. Around midnight again, I heard it. The steps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was closer this time, circling the camp. I could hear the sniffing again, but louder, as if it was right outside the thin wall of fabric. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The slow drag of claws against the side of my tent. The fabric quivered slightly as if something had brushed against it. I didn't move. My hand slid slowly to the bear spray near my sleeping bag, though I knew if the bear tore through, it might not be enough. The steps circled again, then stopped right at the front. I could hear it breathing, deep and heavy. Right there, the thin zipper separating me from it seemed useless. I could smell it now, a musky, sour odor that made my stomach twist. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, the sound shifted away. The bear moved slowly back into the trees, the crunch of its steps fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't close my eyes again that night. I sat upright, gripping the spray, waiting for light. When morning finally came, I made my choice. I wasn't staying another hour. I packed quickly, hands shaking as I tried to keep steady. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't even stop for water. I threw everything into my bag, broke down the tent in record time, and started back toward the trailhead. My eyes scanned the trees constantly, every dark shape between trunks making my chest tighten. The hike back felt endless. My legs were sore, and the pack dug into my shoulders, but fear pushed me forward faster than I thought I could move. At one point, I heard movement behind me. I froze, listening, but it stopped. I kept going faster now. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the clearing of the trailhead. My car sat there, the only vehicle in the lot. Relief hit me so strong I almost stumbled. I threw my pack inside, climbed in, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. I sat there for a while, shaking, my body drained. When I finally drove away, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see something following, though of course there was nothing. Only the empty road and the trees fading behind me. I didn't go camping alone again for a long time after that. The woods I once found peaceful now carried a different weight in my memory. I had faced the quiet power of something far bigger than me, something that could have ended me without effort, and I realized how thin the line is between safety and danger out there. I still camp sometimes, but I never forget to double-check everything, never cook close to camp, never ignore the smallest sound in the night, because I know what it feels like to lie helpless inside a thin tent with only a can of spray between me and a bear pressing its nose against the wall. And I know I was lucky, luckier than some people ever get. That trip taught me that the wilderness is not mine, it's theirs. We only borrow it for a short while, and sometimes they remind us of that in ways we'll never forget. I grew up loving the outdoors, but for some reason, camping alone always pulled at me in a way nothing else did. There was something about being away from roads, lights, and people that made me feel both nervous and alive. I had been on plenty of group camping trips before, but the year I decided to head out on my own was the first time I realized how different things felt when the sun went down and you had no one but yourself to rely on. I had the idea that this trip would be simple. I wanted a few days alone in the woods to relax, fish, maybe hike around, and just get away from work and noise. I picked a state forest I had been to once with friends, but this time I planned on setting up far deeper than I ever had before, well past where most people camp. I didn't want to be near families, kids, or weekend groups drinking around a fire. I wanted quiet. I packed carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, fishing pole, lantern, knife, some food, a water filter, and a few essentials. Nothing more. I loaded everything into my backpack and started out early in the morning. The first miles on the main trail felt familiar, but once I left the marked path and pushed further into the brush, it was like the forest swallowed me whole. The sound of cars on the highway faded. The air felt thicker. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that felt perfect. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow stream running not far from it. The ground was mostly flat, soft with pine needles, and tucked away enough that I felt hidden from anyone passing through. I set up my tent, stashed my food, gathered wood, and made myself comfortable. The first night was calm. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back listening to the water running in the stream and the faint crackle of burning wood. The stars looked sharper than they ever did in town. By the time I crawled into my tent, I felt tired and content. The forest around me went quiet except for the occasional rustle in the distance, which I told myself was just raccoons or deer. But sometime during that night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was because I was cold, but then I realized it was something else. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. Usually, even at night, you can hear crickets or owls or something moving through the brush, but there was nothing. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something like footsteps. Not running, not rushing, just slow, steady crunches of pine needles and leaves. My first thought was that maybe another camper had wandered too far from the trail. But this deep in, it didn't seem likely. I held my breath and stayed as quiet as I could, straining to listen. The sound seemed to move around my campsite, not coming closer, but circling. After a while, it stopped, and I lay awake for a long time, staring at the thin nylon of my tent, waiting for something more. The morning came, and the woods looked normal again. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe I had dreamed it. I made coffee, fished a little, and tried not to think about it. But that night, it happened again. The second night was worse. I had built my fire up high, thinking the light would give me some comfort. But long after I'd climbed into my tent, I woke again to the same sound. Slow steps, not rushing like a deer bolting, not the random scuffle of a raccoon. It was deliberate, heavy. Someone or something was moving on two legs. I could hear the pine needles give under each step. This time it came closer. I heard it pause near the fire pit, the faint crackle of dying embers still glowing. I could imagine someone standing there, watching my tent. I didn't move. My chest hurt from holding my breath so long. I didn't have a gun with me, only a knife, and the thin walls of the tent felt like paper between me and whatever was out there. After what felt like hours, the sound faded into the distance again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every noise set me on edge. When the morning came, I walked the edges of my campsite, trying to see if I could find footprints, but the pine needles and dirt didn't show much. I told myself I was overthinking, but the unease wouldn't leave me. By the third day, I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to quit. I had looked forward to this trip for months. I told myself if I just got through one more night, I'd be fine. I stayed busy that day, walking further along the stream, collecting firewood, doing anything to keep from sitting still. When night came, I made my fire big and sat closer to it than before. I left my lantern on inside the tent, hoping that maybe the light would make me feel safer. But sometime past midnight, I woke again. This time, the steps were closer, right outside. I could hear twigs snapping softly, the sound of someone shifting their weight. My skin went cold. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I stayed frozen, staring at the fabric wall in front of my face, every nerve in my body waiting. Then I heard it, a slow drag, like something brushing against my tent. The sound of a hand, or maybe a branch, sliding lightly across the nylon. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind, but the air was still. I could hear breathing too, faint, uneven, just outside. I don't know how long it lasted. I gripped the handle of my knife so tight my hand hurt. At some point, the sound moved away again, fading slowly until there was nothing but silence. I sat awake until the sky started to lighten. By morning, I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffing gear into my bag without caring how it fit. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I would see someone standing at the edge of the trees. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, not calm. It felt like it was closing in, like the trees themselves were holding secrets. The hike out felt twice as long as the hike in. Every sound made me flinch. I kept expecting to see someone following me on the trail, but whenever I looked back, it was just empty woods. When I finally saw the dirt road that led back to the parking area, I almost ran. When I reached my car, there was nothing unusual. No broken glass, no sign that anyone had been near it. But I still felt like I was being watched as I threw my pack in the back and started the engine. Even when I pulled out onto the main road, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind me. I never found out who or what it was that came near my tent at night. Maybe it was some drifter living in the woods, maybe a hunter who decided to mess with me, or maybe someone with worse intentions. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. The sound of those steps, the breathing outside my tent, the drag of something against the nylon, it was human. That trip changed how I see the woods. I still go hiking, still spend time outdoors, but I don't camp alone anymore. The memory of lying in that tent, frozen, listening to someone move in the dark just outside, is something I can't shake. Out there, deep in the forest, I realized how vulnerable you really are when the sun goes down and there's no one around to help. Taught me something I won't forget. People are far scarier than any ghost. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the outdoors. Hiking and camping were hobbies I took seriously, though mostly in controlled, well-marked areas. But that summer, I decided to push myself further. I wanted something completely remote, somewhere that didn't have cell service, road access, or other hikers wandering through on weekends. The area I picked was deep in the northern forests, a place mostly untouched, where maps barely indicated any trails and the only human presence came from an occasional ranger cabin that was miles apart. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because I wanted the experience to be mine alone, uninterrupted. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and basic survival gear. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, first aid kit, a few knives, and a compass. I also brought a flare gun, not because I thought I'd need it, but because it felt like a responsible precaution. I left early in the morning, driving until the pavement ended, then following a rough dirt track as far as my old Jeep could handle. The last few miles I had to go on foot, dragging my backpack over uneven ground, through thick undergrowth, and across a small creek that turned out to be surprisingly swift and cold. By the time I found a spot to set up camp, the sun was dipping behind the ridges. The forest here was dense, with towering pines and firs that blocked much of the light even in the afternoon. I picked a small clearing near a rocky rise, where I could see a bit of the terrain around me. Setting up the tent was harder than I expected. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and stones. I worked slowly, making sure everything was secure, my muscles screaming as I hammered stakes into the hard soil. Once the tent was up, I decided to scout the immediate area. I needed to familiarize myself with landmarks in case I had to move or navigate at night. The forest was alive with sounds: birds calling, insects buzzing, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, almost soothing, but there was also an undertone of alertness I couldn't shake. Out here, everything moved silently until you realized it was there. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, careful not to make it too large, knowing that smoke could travel far and draw attention. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, eaten straight from the pot. The warmth of the fire and the act of eating slowly calmed my nerves, but I remained vigilant. Shadows flickered around me, and every small snap of a branch made me pause. I reminded myself it was probably a deer or some other small creature, but my heartbeat didn't always listen to logic. I slept lightly that night, waking at odd intervals. The wind shifted in a way that made the trees groan, and I could hear animals moving closer than I expected. Once, a loud rustling near the edge of the clearing made me freeze mid-breath, listening to something heavy push through undergrowth. I reached for my knife, even though I had no idea what I'd do if it wasn't something harmless. Eventually, the noises subsided, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I set out to explore further, following a faint game trail I noticed near the creek. The terrain was rugged. I had to climb over fallen logs and navigate through thick ferns. The air was damp, and the forest smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Every few steps, I saw signs that I wasn't the first to be here. Animal tracks, a broken branch, the distant echo of a bird startled into flight. As I moved deeper, the light dimmed under the dense canopy, and I realized that I couldn't tell north from south without checking my compass constantly. I reached a small hill overlooking a valley. From there, I could see the treetops stretching endlessly in every direction. I tried to note landmarks, the shape of a particular ridge, a bend in the creek, but everything seemed uniform. The forest had no scale. It went on forever, and I knew if I wandered too far, returning to my tent would be harder than I imagined. Later that evening, I noticed something strange: a set of footprints near my campsite. At first, I thought they were mine, but the impressions were deeper, wider, and spaced differently. They weren't human. My stomach tightened as I examined them, tracing the path from the tree line to the edge of my clearing. They were fresh. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A large deer? Maybe even a wild dog. I checked my surroundings carefully, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, but I didn't relax. That night was worse than the first. The sounds were closer, heavier. Something large moved in the underbrush, and the ground thudded with steps that didn't sound like any animal I knew. I could hear it circling, snuffling, sometimes pausing, listening. I stayed inside the tent, flashlight off, barely breathing, convincing myself it was curious rather than aggressive. But when I heard a low, guttural snort and a branch snap close enough to rattle my stakes, I realized I had no choice but to confront reality. Whatever was out there, it was big, it was capable, and it was aware of me. By dawn, I was exhausted. Sleep had been fragmented. My body tensed the entire night. I made a plan. I wouldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, trying not to make noise, and secured the tent for potential reuse if necessary. My route back was more cautious. I kept my flare gun and knife ready, moving slowly, listening for the faintest hint of movement. The forest that had seemed majestic and inviting now felt oppressive, alive in a way that made every step tense. As I descended the hill, I finally saw it. A large black bear, emerging from the tree line, sniffing the air. My heart stopped. I froze, remembering all the wildlife advice I'd ever read. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. It seemed unaware of me at first. Then it turned, its gaze scanning the area, ears twitching. It wasn't aggressive yet, but its size and power were undeniable. I slowly backtracked, keeping low and avoiding sudden movements. Eventually, it moved away, disappearing into the dense forest, leaving only broken branches and disturbed leaves. I didn't stop until I reached my Jeep hours later, drenched in sweat, muscles aching, adrenaline still pumping. Driving back on the rough dirt track, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following me from the forest, though I knew logically I was finally out of immediate danger. When I reached the first paved road, I allowed myself to relax, slowly, though my mind replayed every sound, every shadow, every footprint. That trip taught me more about the wilderness than I could have learned from books or short hikes. It was beautiful, terrifying, and humbling. I hadn't conquered the forest. I had merely survived it, and barely. My respect for the quiet, massive, patient power of nature had deepened profoundly. Even now, years later, when I think back to that night, I remember every detail: the weight of the darkness, the crunch of leaves under invisible feet, the scent of damp pine, the sheer, heart-pounding presence of a creature far larger than I. I never returned to that exact spot, but I carry the memory like a warning. Out there, the forest is alive, and it doesn't care if you're ready. Survival is about respect, awareness, and the knowledge that fear isn't a weakness. It's a tool. I always liked camping alone. People often told me it wasn't safe, that it was stupid to head out into the woods by myself with just a tent, a sleeping bag, and some food. But I never liked the noise of group camping. Never liked how people ruin the quiet with music, chatter, and constant phones buzzing. For me, the point of camping was to hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees, the crackle of a small fire, and maybe the splash of water if I camped near a stream. I liked the silence, the isolation, the way my head cleared when I was out there. It was late summer when I packed for another trip. The heat during the day was still strong, but nights were already cooler, which made it easier to sleep. I chose a spot a few hours from home, a forested state park I had been to once before. There weren't many people around this area, not the kind who came to party at campgrounds with RVs and loudspeakers. This place was quieter, more spread out. A trail wound several miles into the trees, ending at a clearing near a small lake. That's where I decided to set up for a few nights. I arrived in the afternoon. The sun cut through the canopy in patches, golden stripes shifting with every gust of wind. I walked slowly, my pack heavy but comfortable, my boots crunching over dirt and fallen branches. The trail smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I passed no one. The deeper I went, the quieter everything felt. By the time I reached the lake clearing, I couldn't hear the distant hum of cars anymore. Just wind, water lapping, and the occasional bird call. I picked a spot near the treeline, where the ground was flat and soft with grass. I set up my tent, spread out my gear, and gathered some wood for a fire later. Everything felt calm, exactly the way I liked it. The lake surface shimmered, the air cooling as the sun lowered. I ate a simple meal, bread and jerky, and sat by the fire as darkness moved in. Nights in the woods were always the best part for me. The shadows stretched long, the air smelled colder, and the fire popped and hissed. I watched the stars rise in the gaps above the trees. For hours, I sat there with nothing to do, nothing to worry about, just the quiet. Eventually, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent, sliding into my sleeping bag. I lay there listening to the faint rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the soft wash of lake water. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It happens often when I camp. Strange sounds, unfamiliar environment. I rolled over, pulled the bag tighter, and listened. At first, it was nothing unusual, maybe just an animal moving through the brush. But after a moment, I heard a distinct crunch of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. My body stiffened. I held my breath, listening. The steps grew closer, not circling, just approaching. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe even a bear. The sound stopped a short distance away, just outside the tent. I could feel the hairs rise on my arms. I waited, every muscle tight, my heart thudding. Then, faintly, I heard another sound. Not an animal sound. The soft shift of clothing. A human sound. I lay frozen in the dark, staring up at the thin tent fabric. Whoever it was, they didn't move for a while. Just stood there, silent, watching. I didn't make a sound. I didn't unzip the tent or grab my flashlight. I just stayed still until finally, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. They moved slowly away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little sound made me jump. By morning, when the sun lit the tent, I unzipped it carefully and stepped out. The grass around camp was pressed down in places, and I could see faint impressions in the dirt near the trees. Footprints, not boots but shoes. Someone had been there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just another camper wandering around at night. Maybe someone who had gotten lost and passed by. But it didn't feel like that. The way the person stood there so quietly, so close to my tent, it didn't seem like someone just moving through. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had hiked all the way out here. I told myself it was fine, that I was just overthinking. So I stayed. I spent the day by the lake, fishing with a small line I carried, reading a book I had stuffed in my pack. Everything seemed normal again, but every time the wind blew hard and leaves rattled, I thought I heard footsteps. Every time I looked up from the water, I half expected someone to be standing at the treeline. By evening, I tried to shake it off. I built another fire, cooked some food, and tried to relax. The night came down heavy, and with it, the unease returned. I checked the area around my tent carefully, shining my flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing. Eventually, I forced myself into the tent and zipped it shut. This time I didn't sleep long. In the middle of the night, I woke again to the same sound. Slow footsteps closer than before. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still, trying to control my breathing. The steps stopped right outside. Then I heard it, the faint drag of a hand brushing against the fabric of my tent. A slow, deliberate slide, tracing along the surface. My throat felt dry, my palms sweaty. The hand moved across the side of the tent and stopped near the zipper. I thought I was going to hear it open, but instead, nothing happened. Just silence. Whoever it was stayed there, crouched low, waiting. I could almost feel their presence through the thin barrier. I stayed like that for what must have been an hour, muscles locked, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sound moved again, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I grabbed my things and made a quick decision to cut the trip short. I started packing fast, shoving everything into my pack. That's when I noticed something on the ground near the fire pit. A piece of cloth, like part of a torn sleeve, dirty and frayed. I hadn't dropped it. Someone had left it. I hiked out as quickly as I could, heart pounding the whole time. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. Every snapping branch made me glance behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I never stopped feeling watched. When I finally reached my car, parked near the trailhead, I threw my pack inside and locked the doors right away. My hands shook as I sat there, trying to steady myself. That's when I saw it. On the rear window, smeared faintly into the layer of dust, was the mark of a handprint. Fresh. Someone had touched my car. I drove home without stopping, checking the mirror every few seconds. I don't know who that person was or why they had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't just passing by. They had been watching me, following me, waiting. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I had been wanting to get away from the noise of the city for a while. The stress of long work hours, traffic, and the same daily routine had been eating at me. So when I came across an old listing online about a farmhouse out in the countryside where people could camp or rent the place, I thought it would be a good break. The photos showed a big open field, a worn-down barn, a house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, and woods stretching far out in the distance. It looked quiet and far from everything, exactly what I thought I needed. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, knife, small cooking gear, and enough food to last me 3 days. I told myself it would be simple. Just set up camp in the open space near the farmhouse, walk around during the day, cook my own food, and at night sit by the fire under the stars. I wasn't looking for excitement, just silence. The drive took almost 4 hours. I had to leave the main highway and follow a narrow road that seemed like it hadn't been repaved in decades. On both sides of the road, fields stretched out endlessly, with tall grass and occasional broken fences. It felt like I was driving into nowhere, and the further I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. At one point, I didn't pass another car for almost an hour. The road was empty, the fields lifeless, and when I finally saw the top of the farmhouse roof peeking over a hill, I felt a strange sense of relief. When I pulled up to the farmhouse, I noticed how worn down it looked compared to the photos. The wood on the walls was rotting in places, the roof sagged slightly, and the windows were either boarded up or covered in a thick layer of dirt. There was a barn nearby, even worse in shape, its door hanging half open and creaking in the wind. The grass around the house was waist-high, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in years. The silence struck me first. Out in the countryside, I expected to hear at least birds or insects, but around the farmhouse it was unnervingly quiet. It felt like the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. I told myself it was fine. I had come here to get away from noise anyway. I set up my tent a little distance from the house, closer to the open field where the grass wasn't so tall. I cleared a small space for a fire pit and stacked some dry wood I had brought with me. The air smelled faintly of dirt and something musty, almost like damp wood that had been left too long in the shade. By the time I finished setting everything up, the sun was beginning to lower, throwing long shadows across the farmhouse. The building looked darker with the sunlight fading, and the empty windows looked almost hollow. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, ate quickly, and then walked around the property to stretch my legs. The barn was the first thing I checked. The wooden boards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, and the smell of old hay and rust filled the air. Broken tools were scattered on the floor, and old ropes hung from the beams. There were empty stalls where animals had once been kept, but they were filled with nothing but dust. In the far corner, there was a pile of broken boards, as if someone had once tried to patch a hole in the wall and gave up. It didn't feel threatening, just abandoned. Still, being in there made me uneasy, so I didn't stay long. The farmhouse itself was locked when I tried the front door. The wood was soft with rot, but the lock still held. I didn't push too hard, I wasn't trying to trespass inside, and I figured the point was to camp outside anyway. Still, I walked around it, looking at the peeling paint and the vines crawling up the walls. The windows on the backside had cracks in the glass, and one had a hole big enough for a person to squeeze through. For a moment, I thought about peeking inside, but the thought of crawling into that dark place alone didn't sit right with me, so I walked away. By nightfall, I had my fire going. I sat on a folding chair, watching the flames rise and listening to the occasional pop from the wood. The silence around me was so heavy that even the crackle of the fire sounded too loud. I tried to relax, but I found myself glancing at the dark shape of the farmhouse again and again. It stood there, black against the night, the broken windows reflecting the firelight faintly. I told myself I was just letting my imagination run. Old buildings looked creepy at night, that was normal. I focused on the fire, ate a little more, and eventually crawled into my tent. I zipped it shut and laid down in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of wind moving through the tall grass. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke up again in the middle of the night. It was pitch black inside the tent, and the fire outside had gone down to nothing but faint embers. I lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, faint footsteps in the grass. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering near the campsite, but the steps were too steady, too heavy. They sounded like boots pressing into the dirt, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I lay there, holding my breath. The steps grew closer, circling near my tent, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even dare unzip the tent to look. Whoever or whatever was out there stood still for what felt like minutes. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the fabric of the tent, a light touch, like a hand dragging across it. Every muscle in my body was tight, waiting for the tent to be unzipped or cut open, but nothing happened. After a few more seconds, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance toward the farmhouse. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, clutching the knife I had packed, ears straining for every sound. My mind raced with thoughts. Maybe someone else was living out here, squatting in the farmhouse or the barn. Maybe they had noticed me setting up camp and waited until night to check me out. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of the tent with stiff limbs, looking around. The field looked the same as before, empty and still, but when I looked at the ground near my tent, I saw footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human, boots. I decided I couldn't just pack up and leave right away. I had come all this way, and leaving after one night felt like giving in to fear. Still, I knew I had to be more cautious. I spent the morning exploring farther, looking for any sign of someone living nearby. I checked the barn again, nothing new. I circled the farmhouse, and near the back I found what looked like a path through the tall grass leading into the woods. The grass was bent down as if someone had walked it recently. I thought about following it but stopped myself. If someone really was out there, I didn't want to run into them unprepared. Instead, I went back to camp, kept my knife on me, and tried to act normal. I cooked. I read a book I had brought, and I tried to convince myself the night had just been my imagination. But that night, it happened again. I had built the fire higher and stayed awake longer, but when I finally laid down in the tent, I couldn't help drifting off. Sometime in the night, I woke again to the sound of movement. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was the creak of the farmhouse door. My eyes snapped open, my chest tight. I hadn't been able to open that door myself the day before, but now I could hear it clearly, opening slowly, the hinges groaning. The sound echoed faintly across the field, and then silence. I sat frozen, gripping my knife, listening so hard it hurt. After a long stretch, I heard the door creak shut again, followed by faint steps moving through the grass. They came closer, stopping just short of my tent once more. I didn't breathe. My skin felt cold even though I was sweating. Then, the sound of scratching, faint but clear, at the fabric of the tent. Not like claws, like fingers. I almost jumped out then and there, but fear pinned me down. Whoever was out there, they were testing me, maybe trying to see if I would react. After a while, the steps moved away again, back toward the farmhouse. By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I packed everything quickly. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I threw my gear into the car, doused the fire, and before leaving, I looked one last time at the farmhouse. The front door, the one that had been locked, now hung slightly open. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The house grew smaller behind me, but the image of that open door burned into my mind. I knew someone had been in there all along, watching me, maybe waiting for the right time. I didn't stop until I reached the highway again, and when I finally merged back into traffic, I felt the tension ease from my body. The silence of that place, the footsteps, the scratching, I couldn't shake them. That farmhouse wasn't abandoned. Someone was living there. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who made sure I knew it without ever saying a word. I never went camping alone again. I had been planning a solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from noise, work, and the usual routines that kept me restless even when I was at home. I didn't want a popular campsite where families gathered or hikers passed through every hour. I wanted silence, isolation, and the feeling of being cut off from everything familiar. That was why I had chosen the area near the northern woods, a stretch of land that didn't appear on many tourist maps. I had read that loggers once worked there decades ago, and a few structures still remained, but most people avoided it because the trails were barely maintained. That was exactly what I was looking for. The trip began on a warm August morning. I parked my car near a dirt pull-off by the main road, loaded my backpack, tightened the straps, and started walking into the woods. The path was narrow, the kind of trail where plants grew into the way and branches hung low enough that I had to duck often. There was no sound except for the crunch of my boots on dry soil and the faint buzz of insects circling around my arms and neck. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed heavy. The trees were close together, tall pines and thick oaks blocking most of the sunlight. Occasionally, I passed moss-covered stumps, their edges rotted and soft to the touch. It smelled of wet earth and pine sap, the kind of smell that stays in your nose long after you leave. I walked for nearly 3 hours before I found the small clearing I had marked on my map. It wasn't anything special, just a flat area with enough space to set up a tent. But when I dropped my pack and looked around, I noticed something else. About 100 yards away, through a line of crooked birch trees, I saw the edge of a structure. I moved closer and realized it was an old cabin. It stood half hidden behind brush and vines, its wooden walls gray with age. Parts of the roof sagged, and the small porch was littered with broken planks. The windows were dark, some of the glass cracked, others entirely missing. It looked abandoned, but it was intact enough to show that people once lived there. At first, I felt a surge of curiosity. It was strange to stumble upon something man-made in the middle of thick woods like this, especially when it wasn't marked on any map. I circled around it, taking slow steps, trying to picture the lives of whoever had built it. I imagined loggers, hunters, or a family who had once used it as a summer retreat. The place was silent. No birds perched on the roof, no animals stirred near the porch. Even the usual background hum of the forest seemed quieter around it. I felt a little uneasy, though I told myself it was only because it was unexpected. I decided not to camp inside the cabin. I wanted the tent experience, and besides, the roof didn't look safe. But I set up my tent in the clearing close by, telling myself it would be useful to have the cabin nearby in case of rain. Once the tent was up, I collected firewood and boiled water for a meal. The day passed quietly. I hiked a bit deeper into the woods, carrying just a water bottle, trying to see how far the trail extended. The forest grew thicker, darker, and I noticed that the ground dipped into shallow ravines filled with ferns. At one point, I thought I saw a deer slip between the trees, but when I followed the sound, there was nothing. I returned to camp before the sun began to set. By evening, I had a small fire going, and the clearing glowed orange in the fading light. I sat on a log, eating, feeling the comfort of warmth and routine. The cabin stood in the background, shadowed and silent. As night fell, I kept glancing at it. The way its roof formed a sharp angle against the dark sky, the way the open window looked like an empty eye socket. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was watching me, though I knew that was only my mind playing tricks. When it grew late, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. The forest at night was loud, crickets, the occasional snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. I lay still, trying to let the sounds blend into background noise, but I noticed something different. Every so often, there was a noise from the cabin's direction, a creak like weight shifting on wood. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old boards settling in the cooler night air. But the noise came again, slower this time, as if someone was stepping carefully. I lay awake for hours, staring at the roof of my tent. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, though my sleep was shallow and filled with shifting images of dark windows and hollow rooms. In the morning, I tried to laugh it off. Daylight always made fears look silly. I brewed coffee over the fire and looked at the cabin again. Its walls looked weaker in the sunlight, the broken boards more obvious. I convinced myself the noises had been natural. I spent most of the day hiking. I wanted to push further along the trail, mapping it for myself. The deeper I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. Fallen branches blocked the way, and in places I had to push through thick undergrowth. I saw no signs of other people, not even old campfires or cut stumps. It felt like no one had walked here in decades. When I returned in the afternoon, the cabin was waiting in its usual silence. I noticed something then. On the porch, near the door, there was a set of marks I hadn't seen before. They looked like fresh scrapes in the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. I crouched to study them, running my fingers over the grooves. They were too clean, too recent, not weathered by rain or sun. A wave of unease rolled through me. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a bear scratching or dragging something, but the lines were too straight. I stood and backed away, returning to my tent. That night, I didn't sleep. The forest was alive with sounds, but again I heard the ones from the cabin. Creaks, faint thuds, and what sounded like a soft scrape along the floorboards. I lay stiff, my body tense, every sense focused on those noises. Around 2 a.m, I thought I heard something else. The faint sound of movement outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps in the grass. I held my breath until the sound faded. By morning, I felt drained, but I forced myself to pack some food and explore again. I wanted to avoid the cabin, but it was close, always close, like a shadow at the edge of my camp. The third night was worse. After midnight, I heard the clear sound of footsteps on the cabin porch. Slow, heavy, one after another. Then silence. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. Minutes passed, and then came the sound of wood shifting, almost like the door moving. I gripped my knife in the tent, though I knew how useless it would be if someone, or something, wanted in. The noises continued, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing outside my tent. Not an animal's huff, but steady, controlled breaths. I stayed awake until dawn, my body trembling. When the sun rose, I forced myself to check the area. The cabin door was slightly open. I was certain it had been closed before. The sight of that narrow gap made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop thinking about who had opened it, and why. I debated leaving that day. I wanted to pack up, hike back, and never look behind me. But I had told myself this trip would be a test, a way to push myself. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that my mind was exaggerating every noise. I stayed. On the fourth night, everything came to a point. I had just put out the fire and zipped myself inside the tent when the noises began again. The cabin groaned. The porch creaked. Then came the steps, steady, closer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I clutched my knife, my palms wet with sweat. The steps moved away, then returned. They circled the clearing. I could hear grass bending under weight, twigs snapping. My breath caught when the sound came right next to the tent. For several minutes, something stood there. I didn't dare move. Then came the sound of dragging, something heavy being pulled across the ground. It scraped against rocks, tore through grass. I lay frozen, the sound moving back toward the cabin. Hours passed before I finally let myself breathe normally again. When morning came, I stepped outside, my legs weak. The ground near my tent showed faint depressions, like footprints. They weren't animal prints. They looked like the shape of boots. I followed them slowly, each step heavier than the last, until they led back to the cabin. The door now stood wide open. I didn't go inside. Couldn't. I packed my gear in silence, my movements sharp and fast. The forest felt hostile now, the air pressing against me, the trees leaning close. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just hiked back the way I had come, my eyes scanning constantly over my shoulder. The walk out felt longer than the walk in. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow seemed to follow. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside and drove without stopping, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never told anyone exactly what happened out there. When people asked about the trip, I said it was fine, that the woods were quiet and peaceful. But at night, when I close my eyes, I still see that old cabin. I always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. The quiet, the break from the noise of cars and voices, the chance to prove to myself that I could manage without all the things that make life easy. I had camped before, but usually with friends, and even then it was never too far from a trail or a spot where other people might pass through. This time I wanted something different. I wanted to push further out, go to a place where I wouldn't hear anyone for days, where the only sounds would be the wind in the trees, the scrape of branches, maybe the crunch of some animal moving across dry leaves at night. I picked a patch of forest that stretched for miles with only a few dirt logging roads cutting through it. I studied maps, marked spots where small streams bent around ridges, and picked an area about 6 miles in from the nearest road. My plan was to hike in early, set up camp near water, and stay for 3 nights. Just me, my pack, and the woods. I wanted that full silence. When I parked at the dirt pull-off in the morning, the air was cool but heavy with the smell of wet leaves. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and everything seemed darker than it should have been for that hour. The trees leaned in on both sides of the narrow trail as I tightened the straps on my pack and started walking. With every step away from the car, I felt the noise of the world fall away. No engines, no voices, just the faint tap of water dripping from branches above. The trail faded fast. After about 2 miles, it was barely a path, and I had to keep checking my map and compass to make sure I was on the right bearing. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I heard the occasional crow, the rustle of a squirrel darting into brush, but otherwise the forest had that thick stillness that makes you feel watched, even when nothing is there. By late afternoon, I found the stream I had marked. The water was clear, sliding over rocks, deep enough in some bends to fill a bottle without stirring up silt. The ground around it was flat enough to set up my tent, but still surrounded by thick trees that gave the place a boxed-in feeling. It wasn't wide open like campgrounds usually are. It was a pocket, a hidden spot. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started setting up. The tent went up fine, though the ground was soft and the stakes didn't bite as deep as I wanted. I laid out my sleeping bag, hung a tarp line for gear, and set a small fire ring with rocks from the stream bank. The fire smoked more than it burned, damp wood hissing as it caught. Still, I managed to get enough heat for a small meal and sat there as the light dimmed, listening to the stream and staring into the weak flames. When night finally sank in, the forest changed. The stream's gurgle sounded louder in the dark, like it was the only thing left alive. The trees, which had looked so ordinary during the day, now leaned over the camp in heavy shadows. I lay in my sleeping bag with my headlamp turned off, just listening. Cracks in the brush, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, drifted around me. I knew most of it was probably deer, raccoons, maybe a fox, but when you're alone in a place like that, every snap feels close. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not the scurry of an animal, not the hop of a deer. These were heavy, pressing into the damp ground just beyond the nylon of my tent. I froze in my bag, hardly breathing, straining my ears. The steps moved from one side to the other, pausing now and then fading into the brush. I lay there for hours after that, unable to sleep, gripping the handle of the knife I kept near my bag. When the gray light came through in the morning, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The ground was soft, but I didn't see clear tracks. The leaves were disturbed in places, pressed down, but nothing that told me what it had been. It left me unsettled, but I pushed it aside and went about making breakfast. The second day, I hiked around the area, following the stream up a ridge where it thinned into smaller runs of water and then into damp soil. The forest seemed endless, every ridge leading to another. At one point, I thought I heard chopping, like wood being struck, but when I stood still and listened hard, it stopped. Maybe it was a branch cracking in the wind, though there wasn't much breeze. I never saw another person. That night, I kept the fire going longer, feeding it more than I normally would have. The flames threw light against the trees, keeping the darkness back just a little. Still, when I finally let it burn down and crawled into my tent, the same unease settled over me. Again, in the middle of the night, I woke to noises. Not steps this time, but something brushing against the tent wall lightly, like a hand or a branch being dragged. I sat up, holding my knife, my chest tight with fear. The sound stopped after a while, but I couldn't bring myself to move the zipper and look. Morning came slow. I stepped out, bleary, and looked around. The ground near the tent showed marks, scuffs where the leaves had been pushed aside, not the neat tracks of animals. They curved around the tent in an uneven half circle. I stared at them, feeling my stomach sink. I told myself it could have been a deer nosing around, but I had been in the woods enough to know deer didn't move like that. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and heading back to the car. But a part of me hated the idea of cutting the trip short out of fear. I had come out here to test myself, to stay alone, to prove I could handle the quiet. I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that being alone was messing with my head. I pushed through it. That afternoon, I walked downstream, farther from camp than before. The stream curved through thicker brush and deeper gullies. After a while, I noticed something caught in the branches overhanging the water. A shirt, faded, torn, stained dark on one side. It hung there like it had been placed, not washed in. My stomach knotted as I stood staring at it. There were no trails out here, no reason for a shirt to be left. I didn't touch it. I just turned back and walked fast to camp. The air felt heavier that evening. The woods were too quiet. Even the birds seemed gone. I built the fire again, bigger this time, sitting close to it as the shadows thickened. I couldn't shake the image of that shirt swaying over the water. When night came, I lay in the tent gripping the knife again. I didn't even try to sleep. Around midnight, I heard them. Footsteps again, slow, circling. I held my breath. Then the sound of something tapping against one of the tent poles. Not hard, just enough to make it bend slightly. My mouth went dry. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would shake the nylon. The noises went on for what felt like hours. Steps, brushing, tapping. At one point, something tugged at the tarp line where I had hung my food. The rope creaked. I thought it would snap. Then silence. I must have drifted in and out after that, because the next thing I knew the gray light was back. I stepped outside, and the sight stopped me cold. My tarp line was cut. Not torn, not snapped. Cut clean through. The food bag was gone. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching me, messing with me, waiting. I packed fast, barely stopping to eat. My eyes kept darting into the trees, catching shadows that felt like movement. The 6 miles back felt longer than the hike in. Every crack of a branch behind me made me turn, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the car, the relief hit so hard I almost dropped my pack as I unlocked the door. I tossed everything inside and drove out on that dirt road without looking back. Later, when I unpacked at home, I noticed something that made my skin crawl all over again. My knife, the one I had kept with me in the tent every night, was gone. I knew I had packed it. I knew I had set it next to me, but it wasn't in the bag, it wasn't in my gear, it wasn't anywhere. Someone had been there with me, close enough to reach inside while I slept. I never camped alone again. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks, thinking it would be a way to reset myself after months of stress from work. I wanted to be far away from people, from traffic, from glowing screens and noise. I wanted the woods, the quiet, the smell of pine and damp soil, and the kind of silence that can make your ears ring. I picked a state forest I had never been to before, one that stretched miles in every direction. Most people who went there stuck to the marked campgrounds, but I had read about scattered backcountry spots where you could set up your tent alone. That was what I wanted. Complete isolation, nothing but trees, rocks, and the long dark nights. I started late in the morning, my pack heavy on my shoulders, my boots pressing into the dirt trail that led deeper into the forest. The air was humid, and the smell of wet leaves hung thick. Cicadas buzzed loud from the treetops, their droning mixing with the distant calls of birds. I walked for hours, the sweat soaking my shirt, the straps of the pack biting into my shoulders. The trail narrowed the farther I went, and soon the ground beneath me was uneven, covered with roots and sharp stones. Felt good, though. Every step carried me away from the rest of the world. By early afternoon, I found a small clearing not far from a stream. The water was shallow but clear, sliding over smooth rocks, and it made a constant soft sound that I thought would help me sleep at night. The clearing itself was just wide enough for my tent. I set it up, laid out my sleeping bag, and built a fire pit from stones I gathered nearby. I cooked a simple meal on my little camp stove, then sat for a long time just staring at the trees. The forest had a way of looking endless when you stopped moving. The trunks stood like pillars, the canopy thick, with only thin rays of sunlight cutting down through the green ceiling. For most of that first day, nothing felt unusual, just the calm of being alone. I hiked around the area a little, followed the stream, and filled my bottle with filtered water. The only signs of animals were tracks in the mud. Small deer prints, raccoon paw marks, and once, what I thought might have been the pads of a much larger animal pressed deep into the earth. I told myself it was probably a big dog from someone else who had passed through. Still, I noted the direction of the prints, heading north, away from the stream and into thicker brush. By the time the sun began to lower, the forest changed. The heat drained away, and the air cooled quick. The light shifted from gold to gray, and the sounds of birds fell off one by one until the silence grew heavy. I built a fire in the pit, the flames making the shadows around me jump and twist. I ate again, then crawled into my tent, lying on my back and listening to the forest. At first, all I heard was the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the night deepened, new noises began. Cracks in the underbrush, faint thuds of something moving, distant yelps I couldn't place. I reminded myself this was normal. Forests at night always sounded bigger than they were. Small animals could make huge noises when everything else was quiet. I must have dozed off, but sometime in the middle of the night I woke to a sound that cut clean through my sleep. It wasn't far. A sharp snapping of branches, followed by a heavy step on the ground. I held still, my heart beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. The tent fabric shifted slightly with the wind, and the faint glow from the dying fire outside lit it up in patches. I lay there, straining my ears, and then I heard it again. A step, slow and deliberate, moving around the edge of the clearing. This wasn't the quick scamper of a raccoon. It was something heavy, something strong. The noise circled once, then faded back into the trees. I didn't move for what felt like hours, too afraid to unzip the tent or look outside. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under, but the sleep was thin, broken by dreams where I felt watched. Morning light came weak through the tent walls. When I finally unzipped the door and stepped out, my fire pit was cold, and the forest was dripping with dew. At first I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, just nerves from being alone. But when I walked to the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Prints, deep, wide, and clear in the mud. A wild animal had come through in the night, much larger than a dog, too wide for a deer. They circled my camp, some pressing close to the tent itself before veering away. I crouched over them, my chest tight, and traced the outline with my hand. They looked like a cat's paw, only massive, with pads pressed deep and faint claw marks showing at the tips. A mountain lion. That was the first thought that filled my head. I had read about them being in this state, though sightings were rare. They were quiet hunters, capable of stalking without a sound until the very last second. The idea that one had come so close while I slept made my stomach turn. I tried to steady myself, convincing myself it had only passed through, curious, and had moved on. I forced the thought aside, made breakfast, packed a small bag, and went for a hike to shake the feeling. The forest during the day seemed less threatening. Sunlight streamed through breaks in the canopy, birds sang again, and the world looked alive instead of hostile. I followed the stream for miles, stopping at times to look for fish or refill my bottle. Nothing strange happened. By the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, I almost believed I had overreacted. But that night, the unease returned. I built another fire, bigger this time, and fed it until the flames roared. Darkness fell fast again, swallowing everything outside the fire's circle of light. I ate, cleaned up, and zipped myself into the tent, but I left the fire burning high. For hours I lay awake, listening. The forest was restless. Cracks and thuds echoed far and near, always too quick for me to place. Then came the sound I dreaded most, a low growl, faint but clear, drifting in from the trees. My blood went cold. It wasn't close, but it was real. The sound of something alive, warning, or claiming territory. I lay still, every muscle locked, and then came the steps again, heavier than the night before. They circled wider, staying just beyond the firelight, as if testing. Every so often, I caught the faintest glimpse through the tent's mesh movement, a shadow sliding between trees. My mind told me not to look too long, not to imagine shapes, but my instincts screamed that I was being watched. Hours dragged. The animal never came closer than the edge of the clearing, but it didn't leave either. I could hear it shifting, pacing, moving slow. Finally, sometime deep in the night, the steps faded. Silence pressed back in, and eventually exhaustion dragged me into an uneasy sleep. The next morning I found more prints, clearer this time, circling closer. Some were less than 10 feet from my tent. My firewood pile had been knocked over. My pack, which I had hung from a tree limb, had claw marks scored down the bark beneath it, as if the animal had stood on its hind legs to try to reach it. My stomach dropped. This wasn't chance. It had come back. It knew I was here. I considered leaving, packing everything and hiking back out. But I was deep in, hours from the nearest trailhead, and the thought of carrying all my gear while something stalked me in the trees made my skin crawl. A part of me told myself I was overthinking. Predators didn't waste energy on humans if they didn't have to. If it had wanted to attack, it already would have. That logic kept me there another day. I spent that day gathering more wood, piling it high, making sure I could keep a fire blazing through the night. I carried a stick everywhere I went, gripping it so tight my hand ached. I ate little, my stomach tight. The forest felt different now. The silence between bird calls stretched too long. The rustle of leaves felt directed, like I wasn't alone for a single step. That night was the worst. I sat by the fire, forcing myself to stay awake. Every nerve in my body stretched thin. Hours passed in a crawl, and then, when the fire burned down to coals, I heard the sound again. A deep growl, closer this time, vibrating through the clearing. I froze, eyes locked on the dark beyond the light. And then I saw them, eyes reflecting the firelight. Low to the ground, unmoving, staring at me. My breath caught. I grabbed the stick, held it in front of me, but I knew it was useless. The animal stayed there, eyes glowing, body invisible in the black. For what felt like forever, it didn't move. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it circled, the eyes vanishing and reappearing at different angles, always just beyond the fire. I fed the flames desperately, tossing wood until sparks shot into the air. The light grew, but the animal didn't back away. Finally, just before dawn, it slipped back into the trees, vanishing with no sound. I sat frozen, every muscle cramped, until the sun rose and the world shifted back into safety. When I stepped out to check, I found the prints everywhere. The ground was torn where it had crouched. I had been looking forward to summer vacation for months. After a long school year that felt like it stretched endlessly, I finally had 2 months completely free, and I wanted to spend them somewhere different, somewhere away from the noise and busyness of my town. I didn't want a typical beach holiday crowded with tourists or a resort full of families with screaming kids. I wanted quiet, I wanted freedom, and I wanted to push myself a little beyond the comfort of everyday life. That was how I ended up deciding to go alone to a remote lakeside cabin in the mountains, a place I had found in a small rental listing online. The cabin was old, simple, and far enough from the nearest road that I would have to hike for about an hour through the forest just to get there. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and a chance to test myself. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through narrow roads lined with dense forest on both sides. The sun was strong and hot, typical of mid-July, but the forest offered shade in patches. I had packed lightly, a backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a week, a small first aid kit, and a handheld GPS device. I wanted to keep things simple, and I wanted to rely on my own abilities. There was a thrill in being completely responsible for myself, knowing that if something went wrong, I could only rely on my own skills. The hike began smoothly. The path was clear, lined with wildflowers, and the air smelled like pine and earth. Birds called in the distance, and a few squirrels darted across the trail. I felt completely alive, breathing in the hot, clean mountain air. By the time I reached a small stream halfway through, I stopped to rest. I knelt by the water, cupping it in my hands, and drank, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat. I didn't see anyone else. I didn't hear cars or motorcycles, just the forest and me. By mid-afternoon, the sun was dipping slightly, and I could see the lake through the trees. The view took my breath away. The water was dark but clear, reflecting the sky like glass. I followed the path down the last stretch, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I expected. Weathered wood, slightly crooked walls, and a rusted metal roof. A small dock stretched into the lake, half sunken in one spot. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust, the kind of smell that always clings to places left alone for months. I spent the first day setting up. I unpacked my things, laid out my sleeping bag inside the cabin, and checked that I had enough firewood. The forest was calm, but there was a quiet tension to it, like the kind you feel when you know you're being watched but don't know by what. I tried not to think about it too much. I made myself a simple meal of canned beans and bread, then sat on the dock watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The water glimmered, and a light breeze rippled across the surface. It was beautiful, but the isolation made me feel small in a way I hadn't expected. That night, I slept in the cabin, listening to the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of something moving in the water, but I slept deeply, too tired from the hike to worry. The next morning, I woke early. Summer mornings in the mountains are crisp, and the air smelled of dew and pine needles. I decided to spend the day exploring the area. There was a trail I hadn't noticed the day before, winding up the hillside behind the cabin. I followed it, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and dry leaves. At first, the hike was easy, but as the path became steeper, I realized it had not been maintained for years. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to push branches aside to move forward. At one point, I lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack, my heart racing not from exertion, but from the realization that I could get lost. By late afternoon, I had made it to a small clearing with a view of the lake from above. The water looked smaller from here, like a dark, glassy mirror hidden among the trees. I rested for a while, eating a granola bar and drinking water. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. On the opposite side of the clearing, there were footprints in the soft earth. Human footprints. They weren't old, they had been made recently. My stomach tightened. I knew this area was remote, and I hadn't seen anyone else since I parked my car at the trailhead. I stood, scanning the treeline, listening. Nothing moved. I couldn't see anyone, and yet the prints were there, fresh, leading further up the hill. I debated whether to follow them. My instincts told me not to, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved quietly, trying to stay on the edge of the clearing. The prints led to a series of smaller trails that twisted through dense underbrush. I followed them carefully, and that's when I realized something more disturbing. The prints didn't just go in one direction. They circled. There was no clear path. They looped around, disappearing and reappearing as if someone or something had been wandering back and forth, watching. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone who lived in the area, but there had been no signs of people, no discarded bottles, no broken branches from someone carrying gear. Nothing, just the prints. I decided it was time to go back. I retraced my steps carefully, making mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. When I reached the clearing again, the prints were gone, vanished. I felt a cold wave of fear. Someone had been there, following me or waiting, and now they were gone. I hurried down the trail toward the cabin, my boots slipping on loose dirt, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the cabin, everything looked normal. Nothing was disturbed. I told myself I was imagining things, that it had probably been an animal, but the shape and size of the prints didn't match anything I knew. That night, I slept lightly, leaving the door to the cabin locked and checking the windows multiple times. Every sound outside, an animal scurrying, the wind in the trees, made me flinch. Around midnight, I was woken by a sudden sound. It wasn't the forest sounds I had gotten used to. It was deliberate, a crunch of footsteps on gravel outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Then came a long silence. I didn't move, my body tense, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. I could feel my heart in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, slowly, moving along the perimeter of the cabin, stopping occasionally. Whoever it was, they were circling the cabin, waiting, observing. I stayed awake until dawn, watching through the window. When the first light hit the forest, the footsteps stopped. I could see the outlines of trees and the lake, calm and still, but I knew the presence hadn't vanished entirely. I spent the morning checking my gear, thinking through ways to defend myself, and considering packing up and leaving. But there was something stubborn in me that wanted to see this through. I couldn't just abandon the cabin without knowing. The following days were tense. I kept my fire going during the night, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the walls. I made sure food was stored securely, hanging it from a tree to keep it out of reach. Each day, I hiked further into the surrounding forest, marking my path carefully. I saw more signs of human presence. Scraps of cloth caught in branches, a discarded water bottle, a makeshift fire pit that looked recent. Someone had been living or camping nearby without my knowledge. The thought made my stomach churn. I never saw the person, but I could feel them watching, following my movements at a distance. It was on the 5th day that the encounter happened. I had decided to explore the far side of the lake, where the trail was less visible and the forest denser. The sun was low, turning the sky a golden orange. I walked along a narrow path when I saw movement ahead. A figure emerged from the trees. I froze. It was a man, thin, wearing dark clothing, carrying a backpack. He didn't say anything. He just stopped, staring at me. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. My heart pounded. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees, moving quickly and silently. I didn't chase him. I knew better. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? Why hadn't he approached directly? I fortified the cabin further, making sure every door and window was secure, and that night I slept in shifts, never fully letting my guard down. The days dragged on. Each time I left the cabin, I felt that same presence, lingering at the edge of my vision. But I also noticed patterns. The man, or whoever he was, avoided me if I made noise, if I moved quickly, if I stayed aware. I realized that he wasn't a random attacker. He was cautious, maybe even respectful in a strange, unsettling way. But the fear never left. By the end of the 2nd week, I had become hyper-aware of everything around me. Every crack of a branch, every ripple on the lake, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt. I remember that summer more vividly than any other. I had just finished my last year of high school, and the sense of freedom was intoxicating. My parents had insisted I take a break from city life, and I convinced them to let me spend a few weeks at a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, far away from the noise and chaos. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a wooden structure, slightly weathered but still solid, tucked away on the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. There was a small stream nearby, the kind that whispered through the rocks and gave the air a damp, earthy smell that made me feel alive in a way the city never could. The first few days were perfect. I spent them hiking along the narrow trails, sometimes wandering too far, but never too worried. I had packed enough food, a map, a compass, and plenty of water. At night, the stars seemed brighter than anywhere else I had ever been. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees or the far-off call of some bird I couldn't identify. It was peaceful, almost meditative. I spent hours lying on the grass near the stream, staring at the sky and feeling like I was part of some secret world that no one else had access to. On the 4th day, I decided to take a hike deeper into the forest. I had noticed a narrow trail branching off the main path, half hidden by overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took it. First, it was easy, almost too easy. The trail was well worn, and it led me to a small clearing where sunlight poured in through the canopy, highlighting patches of moss and clusters of wildflowers. I sat there for a while, resting and enjoying the feeling of being utterly alone. But then I noticed something odd. The trail behind me had started to fade. Not just fade in the way a path does when you haven't used it in years, but in a way that suggested I might have wandered off it entirely without realizing it. I thought I could find my way back by retracing my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Every time I turned around, the angle of the sunlight looked slightly different, and the same clusters of trees appeared in places where they shouldn't have been. A slow, creeping sense of unease settled over me. I kept walking, hoping to find some landmark or familiar trail. Hours passed. My water supply was running low, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the thick canopy. The forest had grown denser, and the air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and decaying wood. I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the cabin. Panic started to creep in. My breaths grew shallow, and my legs ached from walking on uneven ground. As darkness fell, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned campsite. A rusted metal pot lay near a fire pit, and a few tattered pieces of cloth were strewn across the ground. It looked like someone had been there long ago and left in a hurry. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, though the temperature had dropped, but from the realization that I was completely alone in a part of the forest that probably hadn't seen human presence in years. I decided to make camp for the night. I gathered some dry leaves and twigs, trying to start a fire. My lighter flickered and died several times, and by the time I managed a small flame, darkness had swallowed the forest completely. I huddled near the fire, my backpack under my head, trying to sleep, but every rustle in the trees made my heart jump. The noises of the forest, which had been comforting during the day, now sounded menacing. Every branch snapping, every distant thump, made me imagine something moving just beyond the circle of firelight. I told myself it was only the wind or small animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point during the night, I woke to the sound of something moving just beyond the firelight. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching leaves in a rhythm that didn't match the random sounds of the forest. My first instinct was to stay completely still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving slowly in a circle around my camp. I could hear heavy breathing, shallow and tense, almost matching my own. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I wanted to scream, but my voice would have carried into the darkness, and I had no way of knowing if I was truly alone or if there was someone, or something, out there. Hours passed in that agonizing tension. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, jittery, and dehydrated. I waited for the sun to rise higher before attempting to move, and when I finally did, I realized how far I had wandered. The trees were unfamiliar, the landmarks unrecognizable. My sense of direction, which I had relied on for years, had betrayed me completely. Panic returned in waves, but I forced myself to move, sticking to what little sunlight filtered through the branches, hoping it would guide me in some direction. I stumbled across a small creek and decided to follow it, thinking it might lead me to a larger body of water or a trail. The water was cold and refreshing. I drank sparingly, careful not to get sick. Following the creek felt like the safest choice, even though the forest around it was dense and almost oppressive. Hours passed, and I began to notice signs that someone else had been there recently. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, and even a few discarded cans. Each discovery made my heart race, and every shadow seemed to move with intent. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or multiple people, were tracking me as much as I was trying to find my way out. By late afternoon, my legs were burning, my throat raw from dry air, and my stomach grumbling from lack of food. I forced myself to keep going, following the creek. Eventually, the terrain changed, and I found myself at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley. From that height, I could see smoke rising in the distance. My heart leapt, civilization. I scrambled down the rocky slope as carefully as I could, bloodied and exhausted, praying the smoke came from a place that could help me. The smoke led me to a small logging camp. There were a few trucks, stacked logs, and men working with chainsaws and axes. I waved frantically, and one of the workers noticed me. Relief flooded through me in waves I can't even describe. They brought me water, food, and a radio to call for help. I learned that I had been lost for nearly 3 full days. During that time, search teams had been looking for me, and the camp had been informed by the local authorities. I felt a mix of shame, relief, and lingering terror. When I was finally driven back to the cabin, the forest seemed almost welcoming again in the light of day. but I couldn't shake the memory of those long hours, walking in circles, hearing footsteps and breaths that weren't my own. I realized how unprepared I had been. I had underestimated the forest, its ability to confuse, its isolation, and its quiet menace. The sense of freedom I had felt at the beginning of the trip was replaced with a deep respect for the wilderness, and a lingering fear that I might have been alone, but not entirely safe. Over the next few days, I stayed at the cabin, too shaken to go back into the forest. I spent my time examining the trails I had taken, marking them on a map, and reflecting on how quickly everything had spiraled. I understood something essential about the forest. It was indifferent. It wasn't malicious, and it wasn't friendly. It simply existed, and I had been unprepared for its scale, its quiet dangers, and the absolute isolation it imposed. When I finally returned home, I was different. The memory of that summer stayed with me, haunting in subtle ways. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it would have been to get lost permanently, how quickly fear could consume me, and how small and vulnerable I had been. I realized that nature, in its raw form, doesn't bend to human desire or need. It's vast, unpredictable, and patient, and sometimes, being alone in it is the scariest thing imaginable. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of it still sends a shiver down my spine. But that summer taught me lessons I could never have learned elsewhere. Patience, preparation, and a respect for the quiet dangers of the world. And though the fear lingered, it also gave me a sense of clarity, an understanding of limits, survival, and the fragility of the human experience when faced with the raw, indifferent power of the natural world. Even now, years later, whenever I hear the wind rustling through trees, I feel the memory of that isolation and the subtle terror of being completely, utterly alone. And I am grateful that I survived, and grateful that I learned that some freedom comes at the cost of confronting the true scale of the world around us. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. The thought of leaving the city, its smog, the endless noise, and the suffocating routine filled me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt all year. My parents had rented a small cabin by a lake, tucked into a dense forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The drive itself was already an adventure. The roads narrowed, bending around hills and thick clusters of trees. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting restless shadows across the asphalt. By the time we reached the cabin, the air was noticeably cooler, scented with pine, damp soil, and the faint tang of the lake. The cabin looked small but solid, a wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that overlooked the water. Its windows were slightly dusty, but it seemed sturdy, and from the outside, it felt private, isolated in a way that excited me. I carried my backpack, filled with the essentials: books, a flashlight, snacks, and my notebook. I had decided I would document everything that happened this summer, both for fun and to have a record of the experience, whatever it turned out to be. The first day passed slowly, in a comfortable, almost lazy way. My parents unpacked, arranged things in the kitchen and bedrooms, and I spent most of my time exploring the perimeter of the cabin. The forest stretched thickly in all directions, a mix of tall pines and broadleaf trees, their roots tangled and rising above the ground in gnarled patterns. I walked along a faint trail that led toward the lake. The water was clearer than I expected, shimmering under the sun, with fish darting just beneath the surface. The quiet was almost absolute. Apart from the occasional bird call or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, there was nothing. It felt both peaceful and slightly unnerving. By the second day, I had decided to venture further into the forest, moving beyond the marked trails near the cabin. I told myself it was just curiosity, wanting to see how far I could go. But there was a subtle thrill in the idea of being truly alone in the woods. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, my camera, and a compass. The sun was high when I started walking, but the trees cast deep shadows that made it cooler under the canopy. I kept track of landmarks, large rocks, and unusual trees, knowing I needed to be able to find my way back. Hours passed, and I found myself deeper than I had intended. The forest became denser, the trees growing closer together, the underbrush thick and occasionally scraping against my legs. I was moving cautiously, paying attention to sounds and keeping my eyes on the ground for uneven roots or stones. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and a few wildflowers grew in scattered patches. It looked untouched, like no one had been here in years. I stopped to take a photo, crouching carefully on the moss. It was around that time that I first noticed the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the damp soil of the clearing, large and deep. My first thought was that they were from some kind of animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape didn't match anything I recognized. They had 5 toes, but they were unusually long and narrow. Something about them didn't sit right. I followed the prints slowly, trying not to make any noise, moving deeper into the forest. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted, with roots sprawling across the ground like thick veins. The prints led me to a small stream. I paused there, kneeling by the water to drink and refill my bottle. That's when I noticed other signs: broken branches, disturbed leaves, and faint marks on the bark of the trees. Claw-like scratches, though not deep enough to be dangerous, just enough to notice. My heart began to beat faster. I realized I wasn't alone in this part of the forest, though I couldn't see anyone. The idea of turning back crossed my mind, but curiosity kept me moving, just a little further. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip. Shadows grew long and the air cooled. I realized I had no idea where I was. The landmarks I had used earlier looked different in the fading light, and every turn seemed unfamiliar. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps to the stream, thinking I could follow it back to a known trail. But the forest was playing tricks. The path I thought I remembered didn't exist, and every direction seemed equally alien. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. Small twigs snapped in the distance, leaves rustled without wind, and I could hear faint dripping sounds, like water falling somewhere unseen. I kept moving, trying to orient myself, but darkness fell quickly in the forest. The flashlight in my bag had weak batteries, and I had only brought it as a backup. Eventually, I stopped in a small clearing, trying to breathe and gather my thoughts. That's when I saw it, movement just at the edge of the shadows. Something was watching me. I froze. The shape was dark, low to the ground, but I couldn't make out what it was. I thought of running, but the terrain was uneven, and I didn't want to trip in the dark. I decided to climb a small rise to get a better view. As I crested it, the movement stopped. Whatever it was, it had disappeared, leaving no trace. My mind raced, imagining possibilities, wild animals, another hiker, but I didn't hear anyone calling out. Nothing. I decided it was safest to try to find a high point where I could see the surrounding area and maybe find a trail back. I moved cautiously, slipping in mud and brushing against branches, my heart pounding. Every shadow seemed alive. Eventually, I found a ridge with a slightly clearer view. From there, I could see the faint glimmer of the lake far below, reflecting the moonlight. Relief surged through me. I could orient myself and head back. I moved carefully, retracing the general direction, staying close to ridges and avoiding thick underbrush. My legs ached, my hands were scratched from branches, and my clothes were damp with sweat and mud, but the thought of the cabin kept me going. It was well past midnight when I finally stumbled onto a recognizable trail. The path led down to the lake, and soon I could see the faint outline of the cabin in the moonlight. I ran the last stretch, slipping and sliding in the dirt, but finally reaching the porch, gasping for air. My parents were awake, having worried when I didn't return. I didn't speak much, only collapsing into a chair, shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin, wary of venturing into the forest alone. I thought about the footprints, the movement, and the feeling of being watched. Whatever it had been, I had never seen it clearly, but it had been real. My summer continued, but the shadow of that night stayed with me. The awareness that even in beautiful, serene places, nature had hidden dangers and mysteries that could turn a perfect summer into a nightmare. I never went that deep into the forest again, but I kept the notebook, filled with sketches of the footprints and the layout of the trails, as a reminder of what I had survived and the reality that the wild could be unpredictable, terrifying, and utterly indifferent to humans. I had been looking forward to summer vacation for months, imagining long days outside, swimming in the river, and exploring the woods behind my uncle's old house. The house was in a small town far from the city, a place where the air smelled different, heavier, and where you could hear birds, insects, and the wind more clearly than car horns or sirens. I had always loved nature, but that summer, I would learn just how fragile and dangerous it could feel when you were alone. My uncle's house was old, made of wood that creaked in every storm. The paint was peeling, and some of the steps on the front porch had rotted away, making them uneven. When I arrived, the air felt thick and warm. It was the kind of heat that made your clothes stick to your skin, and the sun beat down so strongly that the shadows seemed to shrink. I carried my bag inside, trying to ignore the strange smell of mildew mixed with old wood, and set my things down in the room at the end of the hallway. The room had one window that looked out over the backyard, and from it, I could see the forest begin where the grass ended. The first few days were perfect in a normal summer kind of way. I swam in the river each morning, feeling the cold water hit my skin, and explored the paths in the woods during the afternoon. Birds and squirrels moved around like they didn't care I was there, and the occasional deer would watch me quietly before running away. I found a small clearing in the woods with soft grass, a place where sunlight filtered down through the leaves. I would lie there for hours, reading or just watching the trees sway. At night, the sounds of crickets and frogs were almost soothing, and I felt completely alone but safe, the kind of solitude that feels like freedom. Then, a week into my vacation, things started to feel different. I noticed small signs that I wasn't alone in the woods in the way I had thought. At first, it was simple things. Footprints in the dirt that weren't mine, twigs broken in ways I hadn't done, and the faint smell of smoke one morning when there shouldn't have been any fire. I thought maybe some locals had a campfire, or maybe it was just someone hiking. I didn't worry. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But one evening, as I walked back from the river, I realized the feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see a deer or a fox, but there was nothing moving except the leaves rustling in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was normal, my mind playing tricks, but I felt my heart beat faster and my pace quickened. By the time I got to the porch, I was sweating more from fear than from the heat. I locked the door behind me, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I planned to go further into the woods than I had before. I wanted to see the old creek that twisted through the forest. The path was overgrown, thorny branches scratching my arms and legs. I wore long pants and a long-sleeve shirt, even though the sun was hot, and I carried a small knife in my pocket, more for reassurance than for any real protection. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. No birds sang here, no squirrels chattered. Only the wind whispered through the trees, and my own footsteps sounded too loud. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I found the creek eventually. It was narrower than I expected, with water that smelled faintly of decay. I knelt to touch it, running my fingers through the cold flow. Then I heard it, a snap, like someone stepping on a branch. My head shot up and I froze. There was nothing in sight. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Another snap, closer this time. Then a rustle, just beyond the line of trees. My heart was hammering. I wanted to run back, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground had grown sticky. The noise stopped suddenly, and the silence was worse than the sound. I finally ran back, breaking through the branches, cutting my arms, my mind racing with every possible danger. When I reached the clearing I had found before, I saw something I couldn't ignore. A figure, crouched, almost hidden behind a tree. I couldn't tell if it was a person at first. My first thought was to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. The figure didn't move, and after a few seconds, I ran faster, my feet barely touching the ground, until the woods thinned and I could see my uncle's house in the distance. I didn't go back to the woods that night. I stayed inside, doors locked, listening to every sound. The wind, the groaning of the old house, the distant hoot of an owl, but no footsteps. I slept fitfully, nightmares of someone in the trees following me, watching me, climbing closer. The next morning, I debated whether to leave, but something inside me refused to give in. I had come for adventure, and I wasn't going to run away without knowing what was out there. The following day, I decided to prepare. I brought water, food, a first aid kit, and a small flashlight, though I hoped not to need it in daylight. I moved slowly, listening carefully to every sound. Hours passed with nothing, and I began to relax slightly. Maybe the previous day had just been a trick of nerves. But as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows through the trees, I realized I had wandered further than I had ever intended. The creek twisted in ways I didn't remember, and I knew I had no clear path back. Panic crept in. Then I heard it again, the snap of a branch, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart pounding. The rustling grew closer. I realized I was not alone. I looked around frantically for a way out, but the trees and underbrush seemed endless. My mind raced with possibilities. If it was a person, what did they want? Were they dangerous? The logical part of me wanted to call out, to shout for help, but another part knew that making noise might be the worst thing. I remembered my uncle's advice about staying calm in nature. I crouched low, trying to make myself small, hoping the figure would pass. But then, I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It wasn't fast, but deliberate. I could make out the faint outline of a man, tall, thin, moving slowly as if watching me carefully. I stayed still, counting my breaths. My hands shook. I had no weapon that could help if he came close, only the small knife in my pocket. Hours seemed to pass. The figure stayed at a distance, circling, never fully leaving, never coming too close. I realized I couldn't stay hidden forever. The sun was sinking too low. My only chance was to move quietly, stick to the shadows, and hope he didn't notice me. I waited until the figure moved behind a large tree, then ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. My shoes slipped in the mud by the creek. I stumbled but kept going, never looking back. I emerged from the forest just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. My uncle's house was in sight, and I ran the last stretch, heart hammering, lungs burning. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police from the old rotary phone in the kitchen. It took a while for them to arrive. When they did, they searched the woods but found no one. They said it was likely someone living in the forest, watching, maybe even following people for a while before leaving when they sensed they were discovered. They couldn't find him. That night, I slept with every door and window locked. I didn't leave the house again for the rest of my vacation. I watched the woods from the window, always alert, imagining that shadow among the trees. It left me shaken, scared, and aware of how vulnerable we really are when alone in nature. The freedom I had felt at the start of the summer disappeared. I understood then that adventure has a price, that curiosity can lead you to danger, and that some people might be hiding where you least expect. When my parents finally came to pick me up, I felt relief I hadn't known I was craving. The drive back to the city felt safe, the crowded streets comforting. I never went back to that summer spot, but the memory stayed. I remember the heat, the smells, the cold of the creek, the feeling of being watched, and most of all, the lesson I learned. Nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but there is always an element of risk, especially when humans are involved. I came home alive, but changed, more aware of how quickly safety can slip away, how silence can be dangerous, and how summer vacations are not always just fun and freedom. They can also test you in ways you never imagined. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. It wasn't about escaping school or parents. It was about the freedom I felt when I was far from home, when my only responsibility was waking up with the sun and deciding how to spend the day. That year, my parents agreed to let me stay at a small cabin near Lake Sylvan, a place far from the noisy streets and crowded beaches, a place surrounded by dense woods and steep hills. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old and smelled faintly of damp wood and pine, but it was mine for 2 whole weeks, and that was enough. The first morning, I woke to the smell of wet earth and smoke from the fireplace. where I had left some leftover wood burning low. The sun had barely climbed over the hills, but already the air was hot and heavy, the kind of heat that made the leaves hang still and the lake shimmer with a mirage-like shine. I stepped outside barefoot on the wooden deck, feeling the rough planks beneath my feet, and I noticed the fog lifting off the lake, revealing the shallow shore. Mist hovered like a low cloud above the water, curling around the reeds and the stumps of old trees that had fallen long ago. I spent the morning exploring the edge of the lake. The shoreline was rocky and slippery with algae, and the water was colder than I expected, biting my feet as I stepped in. I found sticks that were smooth from being tumbled in the water, stones that were heavy and perfectly shaped for skipping, and strange markings in the mud where birds or small mammals had passed. I didn't see anyone else for hours. The quiet was so complete that it felt almost like the world had paused, leaving me alone to move through it. By midday, the heat became oppressive. I retreated to the cabin, stripping down to shorts and a t-shirt and pouring myself a glass of water from the metal jug I kept in the fridge. Even inside, the air was thick, and the ceiling fan barely stirred it. I decided to take a short nap, leaving the windows open so the slight breeze from the lake could reach me. I slept lightly, half awake, hearing the soft hum of insects outside, the occasional rustle of branches as squirrels chased each other across the treetops. When I woke, the sun was lower, and the woods were beginning to darken under the long shadows of late afternoon. That's when I noticed something odd. A series of footprints led away from the cabin and toward the edge of the forest. They were heavy, deep impressions, not like the light prints left by birds or deer. I frowned. No one else was supposed to be here, and I didn't hear a car arrive. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them, careful not to step in them exactly so I wouldn't disturb the pattern. The prints led into the woods, where the canopy thickened and the temperature dropped. Sunlight filtered through in narrow streaks, and the ground was littered with leaves, pine needles, and broken twigs. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet. Each step made a soft crack underfoot, and every small sound, like the flutter of a bird or the snap of a twig, made me tense. The footprints moved in a straight line, as if whoever had made them knew exactly where they were going. I followed them for almost an hour, my legs aching from climbing over roots and rocks, until they stopped abruptly near a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. It was surrounded by tall pines, the kind whose trunks were scarred with age, and in the center of the clearing, I saw it, a makeshift campsite. There was a tarp tied between two trees, a small fire pit with cold ashes, and scattered supplies. A backpack, a few cans of food, and an empty water bottle. It was clear someone had been here recently. The strange thing was that the prints didn't end at the campsite. They continued, leading further into the woods, but these ones were much lighter, smaller, and more erratic. I hesitated, feeling a tight knot of fear coil in my stomach. I wasn't sure why, but something about this felt dangerous. My first instinct was to go back, to return to the safety of the cabin and call for help, but the other part of me, the part that had spent so much time wandering alone, pushed me forward. I wanted to know who had been here. I continued, moving carefully. The forest floor became more uneven, the path less clear. Thorn bushes snagged at my clothes, and I stumbled over roots hidden under fallen leaves. The air grew cooler and damper, and I noticed a faint smell, metallic and sharp, that I couldn't place. As I rounded a bend, I saw the edge of a small pond, dark and still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. And then I saw it, a flash of movement across the water. Something large, moving quickly, almost too fast to track. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. There was a faint sound behind me, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing. But then the sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my lungs burning. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get back to the cabin. The path I had taken seemed different now, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. Branches scratched at my arms and face, and I fell more than once, scraping my knees and hands on the rough ground. The sound behind me kept pace, slow and heavy, and my fear became almost paralyzing. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it didn't matter. I had to move. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the trees and saw the glint of the lake in the distance. Relief flooded me. I ran down the slope, past the shoreline, and saw the cabin in the fading light. I sprinted across the grass, tripping over roots near the deck, and slammed the door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, listening. Outside, the forest was silent again. Too silent. I spent the rest of the evening boarding up the cabin windows and keeping a heavy stick by the door. I didn't sleep well. Every sound, an animal moving in the trees, the wind brushing against the walls, made me startle. The next morning, I hesitated to go outside, but hunger forced me to venture to the fridge. I made a quick breakfast and decided I needed to explore more to understand what had happened. I returned to the clearing where I had seen the campsite. In the daylight, it looked different. The tarp was old and torn, the fire pit cold, the supplies scattered more haphazardly. I inspected the ground carefully. The deep, heavy prints were gone, replaced by lighter marks, almost like they had been erased or covered. My unease returned, but I forced myself to follow the lighter prints again, this time with a plan. I carried a long branch in front of me, ready to defend myself if needed. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed signs of struggle. Broken branches, disturbed underbrush, and a few bloodstains on the rocks near the pond. The metallic smell was stronger now, unmistakably the scent of blood. Fear shot through me, but I also realized something. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I followed the trail until it ended near an old, abandoned cabin, barely visible through the overgrown weeds and fallen trees. The door was hanging on its hinges, the windows shattered. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, and in the corner, I saw it. A pile of clothes and a backpack, soaked and torn. There were no bodies, no signs of life, just the remnants of someone, or something, that had been here. My stomach turned, and I realized I had been lucky to escape whatever had been stalking me. I didn't stay long. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping my eyes and ears alert. I didn't hear the heavy footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally returned to my cabin, I packed my belongings quickly. I called my parents, who promised to come immediately, and within a few hours, I was on the road back home. Even weeks later, I thought about that summer vacation, about the lake and the cabin and the forest. I realized how close I had come to something dangerous, something I couldn't name. I never returned to Lake Sylvan, but I kept the memory vivid in my mind, a reminder of how thin the line can be between freedom and danger, and how quickly solitude can become terrifying. I didn't tell many people the details. Most wouldn't understand, but I never forgot the quiet fear that had chased me through the trees, and the relief that came with the sun rising over the lake, letting me know I had survived. It was the first week of summer, and I was beyond excited. I had been waiting for this break for months, imagining days spent by the lake near my uncle's old cabin in the woods. He had promised me freedom, quiet, and adventure. The cabin was miles away from any town, tucked deep into a dense forest where the air smelled of pine and dirt. My parents had been hesitant, but after assuring them I would stay safe and that my uncle would look out for me, I finally got their permission. The drive alone was long. The asphalt turned into gravel, and the gravel twisted into a barely visible dirt path that wound around hills and rivers. My uncle's truck rattled with every bump, and I could feel the tension building inside me as the trees grew thicker and taller, their branches forming almost a wall around the road. It was a warm day, the sun hanging lazily in the sky, but under the trees it felt cooler, almost dim, like the forest had its own shade that blocked out the summer glare. When we finally arrived, the cabin was even smaller than I had imagined. Its wooden exterior was weathered, some planks crooked and fading in color, but it had a strange charm. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, and the porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out of the truck. My uncle, a tall, broad man with calloused hands, handed me the key. He gave me a brief tour, showing me where the water pump was, where I could store food safely, and the small generator that provided electricity for a few hours each evening. That first night, I slept poorly. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar. Branches scratching, leaves rustling, and an occasional distant howl that could have been a coyote. I told myself it was nothing, just the wild settling in for the night, but my stomach twisted in nervous anticipation. I hadn't realized how alive the forest could feel at night, how it could press in around you until it felt like the darkness itself was moving. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight slanting through the gaps in the cabin walls. I had planned to explore the area, so I grabbed a backpack, a map, a compass, some food, and a small first aid kit my uncle insisted I carry. The map he gave me wasn't detailed, just enough to mark the lake, the trails, and the main dirt roads, but it was still better than nothing. I headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods, the trees arching overhead, forming a tunnel of green. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds sang, squirrels darted across the trail, and the air was cool and fresh. But after a few hours, I realized I hadn't passed any signs of human activity. No footprints, no discarded trash, nothing that indicated anyone else had been there in days. The forest was vast, quiet except for the natural sounds. That in itself was unsettling. I paused often, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the wind shifting through the leaves. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. The water was clear, and I bent down to drink, grateful for the cool refreshment. I sat on a moss-covered rock and ate the sandwiches I had packed. For a while, the forest felt peaceful again. But as I rested, I noticed something strange. There were marks on the trees, vertical scratches running up the bark. They weren't deep, but they were long, fresh, and sharp. I felt my heart rate speed up. I tried to think logically. Could it be bears? Possibly, but the spacing and shape didn't make sense for claws. And then I remembered what my uncle had told me. Keep your eyes open. The forest is older than you, and not everything in it wants to be seen. Shaking off the unease, I continued along the trail, telling myself I was just imagining things. The path twisted and turned, sometimes climbing steep hills, sometimes descending into shadowy valleys. Hours passed, and I started to lose my sense of direction. The map was barely useful here. The trails were unmarked, overgrown, and the landmarks I had relied on seemed to vanish. Every few minutes, I stopped to check my compass, trying to ensure I was heading back toward the lake. But the forest seemed endless, confusing, and labyrinthine. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled upon an old cabin, abandoned and falling apart. The wood was rotting, windows shattered, and the door hung on one hinge. My first instinct was to avoid it, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the perimeter, noticing faint signs that someone had been here recently. Footprints, small fire pits, and broken cans of food. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here wasn't there now, but the presence was recent enough to unsettle me. I felt a sudden urgency to leave, but as I turned back, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. Panic set in. The sun was low in the sky, and shadows stretched long and thin. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, but the forest was dense, and every tree looked the same. I tried to follow the sound of the stream I had seen earlier, but it was faint, distant. My heart pounded. I remembered my uncle's advice. If you get lost, don't run. Stay calm, make a shelter, and wait for help if you can. I cursed my lack of preparation. I had no signal on my phone, no whistle, no way to call for help beyond shouting until my voice gave out. As night fell, the forest transformed. The temperature dropped quickly, the shadows deepened, and every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of water. I stumbled over roots, my backpack catching on branches. I tried to keep moving, telling myself that I could find the cabin or the lake before it got too dark. But darkness fell faster than I anticipated, and soon I could barely see a foot in front of me. I found a small depression between two fallen trees and decided to make a temporary shelter. I gathered branches, piled them for cover, and huddled underneath, wrapping my jacket tightly around me. The night was long. Every small noise made me flinch. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, imagining everything that could be out there. Wild animals, people with bad intentions, or simply the endless darkness swallowing me whole. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a branch breaking under weight, not a small animal. It was deliberate, heavy, slow steps coming from the direction of the old cabin I had found. I froze, barely breathing, straining to see through the darkness. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the clearing I had chosen. I realized that whatever it was not random. Someone or something was watching me. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be part of the forest. I remembered a trick I had read about in survival guides. Don't make noise, don't move, wait for the threat to lose interest. The minutes felt like hours. My hands were shaking, my stomach twisted in fear. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness. I didn't breathe fully until I heard nothing at all. At first light, I packed my temporary shelter quickly and started moving in the opposite direction of the sounds from last night. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, the soft rush of wind, but I couldn't let myself be distracted. I walked for hours, sometimes crawling under fallen trees, sometimes climbing over steep embankments. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, but the fear of being trapped in the woods alone drove me forward. Eventually, I stumbled onto a wider trail. Relief washed over me. The trail seemed more traveled, and I could see faint tire tracks, suggesting that vehicles had passed through recently. I followed it, moving faster now, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. After what felt like an endless march, I finally saw a familiar landmark, the old wooden bridge that led to the main dirt road near my uncle's cabin. Tears sprang to my eyes. I ran the last few hundred meters, stumbling over roots, not caring about the scrapes and cuts I earned along the way. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch, gasping for breath. My uncle rushed out when he saw me, concern written all over his face. I could barely speak, just pointing toward the woods, trying to convey the terror I had experienced. He didn't press me for details, just wrapped me in a blanket and gave me water. Over the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin, never venturing far. I realized how easy it was to get lost, how quickly the forest could turn from serene to terrifying. I learned to respect it in a way I hadn't before. By the time summer ended, I was more cautious, more aware of the dangers, and more appreciative of safety. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts. They are the real, untamed world around you, indifferent and unpredictable. I left that summer with a mix of relief and pride. I had faced the forest alone and survived. I had made mistakes, I had been scared, but I had endured. The memory of the dark nights, the strange sounds, and the endless trees stayed with me. A lesson that I had been waiting for summer vacation for months. School had felt heavier than usual that year, and the thought of escaping the city heat and chaos was enough to make me restless. My parents decided we would spend a week at a small cabin near a lake a few hours out of town. They promised peace, nature, and a break from technology. The first day, as we drove through winding roads flanked by towering pines, I felt that mix of excitement and unease I often get when stepping somewhere completely new. The sun slanted in the early evening, painting the forest in gold, and the smell of pine and wet earth filled the air. It should have been comforting, but something about the shadows among the trees made me tense. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Its wooden frame creaked slightly when the wind hit, and the deck overlooked the lake, which mirrored the fiery sunset. I spent that first evening exploring the edges of the property, noticing small details. The way the ground sloped sharply behind the cabin, the dense thicket of trees to the side, and an abandoned dock across the lake that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I knew immediately that this place was isolated. There was no one around for miles, and the nearest neighbor's cabin was barely visible through the trees. I slept poorly that night. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and every snapping branch or rustle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the shadows, even though I knew logically there was nothing there. The next morning, I tried to shake off the anxiety. Summer was supposed to be fun. I packed a small bag and decided to explore the area around the lake. The forest around the cabin was dense but not impassable. Birds called overhead, and the occasional chipmunk darted across my path. I followed a small trail I found, which led deeper into the woods. For a while, it was peaceful, almost hypnotic. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of wet soil, the sunlight filtering through branches. But after about an hour, the trail disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The lake, once visible from the cabin, was now just a distant glimmer through the trees. That's when I first noticed the signs. Small footprints, too large to be a dog, pressed into the soft earth. I thought they might be deer, but their spacing and shape didn't match any animal I knew. My heart started to beat faster. I considered turning back, but curiosity made me follow them. The footprints led me through a narrow pass between two clusters of trees and ended at a small clearing. At first, the clearing looked ordinary. Fallen logs, tall grass, sunlight. Then I saw it. A rusted, overturned boat with scratches and dents, and around it, more prints, some partially washed away by a recent rain. They weren't animal prints. Panic started to creep in. I didn't know who or what had been here. I felt suddenly very small, very exposed. My rational mind told me it was probably some other campers, maybe kids from a nearby town, but something in the air told me otherwise. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling, just the faint whisper of wind through leaves. I snapped a few photos on my phone, more as evidence than anything else, and started back toward the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I realized I had lost the trail. Everything looked unfamiliar. Panic surged. I started to jog, hoping I could find something recognizable. That's when I heard it, the first real sign that I wasn't alone. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, breaking twigs under weight heavier than mine. I froze, straining to listen. My first instinct was to call out, but I couldn't. Something told me that drawing attention would make things worse. I tried to keep calm and remember the route I had taken, but every tree looked the same. The lake remained elusive, hiding behind the thickets. I could feel the eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. The footsteps moved closer. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my arms and face, roots tripping me. My chest burned, and sweat streamed down my face, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of the forest. After what felt like hours, I later found out it was maybe only 20 minutes. I stumbled into a familiar clearing near the edge of the lake. The cabin was just visible through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I neared the cabin, I saw a shadow move along the deck, too large and deliberate to be a trick of light. I froze again, heart hammering. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I fumbled with the lock on the cabin door, finally slipping inside and bolting it. Inside, I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. My parents were out fetching water from the nearby stream, leaving me alone for what suddenly felt like the first time. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the shadow, the footsteps, everything. I told myself it was just paranoia, a summer scare, but the unease stayed, thick and heavy, pressing in on me. The rest of that day passed slowly. I didn't leave the cabin, even to look at the lake. Every sound outside made me jump. The cracking of a branch, the flap of a bird, the distant hum of insects. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of clothing or skin, but when I turned, there was nothing. I realized the forest around the cabin didn't feel like it had on the first day. It felt watched. Night came and I forced myself to sleep. I stayed near the window, flashlight on the table beside me, ready to grab it at a moment's notice. The wind rattled the cabin and branches scraped the sides, but I convinced myself it was just that. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I was determined to explore more cautiously. I stayed closer to the cabin, walking the shoreline and marking familiar trees. The lake was calm, deceptively peaceful, reflecting the sky like glass. I even dared to wade into the water, but I kept my back to the forest, unable to shake the feeling that something lingered there. That afternoon, I noticed something disturbing. Small, fresh footprints along the lake's edge, larger than mine, leading toward the woods and stopping abruptly. They were the same size and shape as the ones I had seen the day before. Fear tightened around my chest, but I knew I had to do something practical. I went back to the cabin and found the old, rusted rowboat tied up at the dock. It was wobbly, the wood splintered in places, but it floated. I decided to use it as a temporary safe space. At least in the middle of the lake, I would be able to see anyone approaching. I spent hours drifting near the center, scanning the tree line, but no one appeared. The sun dipped low, and I returned to the cabin as darkness fell. By the third day, I was restless. My parents had gone hiking, and I stayed behind, pretending to read while I really scanned the forest for any sign of movement. That evening, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The front door, locked when I left, was now slightly ajar. I checked the lock. It had been forced. My pulse skyrocketed. I didn't know if it was human or what, but I didn't wait to investigate. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner, a flashlight, and stayed in the center of the cabin, my back to the wall. I didn't sleep again that night. The following morning, my parents returned. They noticed my pallor and the fear in my eyes. I showed them the ajar door, the disturbed cabin, the footprints outside. My father frowned but tried to stay calm. He insisted we stay together and that we would leave the cabin for the rest of the trip if I insisted. That afternoon, we packed up quickly, leaving most of our things behind, and drove back to the city. Even after I returned home, the unease didn't fully leave. I reviewed the photos I had taken, footprints, the overturned boat, the edge of the clearing, and a chill ran through me. The forest had been alive in a way I hadn't realized, alive in a way that was not friendly. The shadows, the silence, the footprints, they were reminders that I had not been alone, even when I thought I was. I never went back to that cabin. For years, I avoided remote lakes, old cabins, and forests where the trees blocked the sky. Summer vacation had been meant for freedom, relaxation, and exploration, but that week taught me something else. Nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent, and sometimes isolation can hide something far more dangerous than the wild. The memory is still vivid. I can see the lake in the sunlight, the dense line of trees, the shadows that seem to move on their own. And I remember the feeling that someone or something had been watching me the entire time, patient, silent, and just beyond my reach. It was a fear that was real, grounded in the world, and it was enough to change the way I saw summer forever. I had been waiting for this summer for months. The week before school ended, I packed my bag with all the essentials. A worn-out tent, a heavy sleeping bag, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small first aid kit, and enough canned food to last a week. My parents had warned me about going too far into the woods alone, but I had grown up in this small town, and I knew the trails like the back of my hand. Or so I thought. The morning I left, the sun was already hot on the asphalt roads, and the air smelled like dry grass and gasoline from the passing cars. I loaded my backpack into my old, rusted car and drove toward the trailhead near Lake Ashton. The summer air was thick, and the hum of cicadas filled the sky. The forest edge was a sharp line of green, a mix of pine and oak, and beyond it lay the trails I had explored countless times as a kid. I parked, checked my supplies one last time, and started walking. At first, everything felt normal. Birds chirped, squirrels darted from tree to tree, and the path crunched softly under my boots. I kept my map in my pocket but mostly relied on memory. My plan was simple. Hike deeper than I had ever gone, camp near the small, hidden lake I had found last summer, and spend 3 days out in the wilderness. The first day passed uneventfully. I followed the narrow trails, stopped occasionally to drink from my water bottle, and admired the sunlight piercing through the branches, creating patterns on the forest floor. I reached the hidden lake around late afternoon. It was smaller than I remembered, but the water was clear, reflecting the tall trees that lined the shore. I set up my tent near a cluster of pines, careful to stay far from the water's edge in case of unexpected rain. Night fell quickly. I lit a small campfire and cooked a can of beans, the smell filling the quiet air. Sitting there, listening to the wind rustle the leaves and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake, I felt peaceful. But as the stars emerged, one by one, the quiet began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. The rustling of the trees, once soothing, now seemed sharper, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. I shook the thought away and crawled into my tent, pulling my sleeping bag close around me. I told myself the fear was just imagination. The first night was uneasy but uneventful. I woke several times to strange noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, but each time I peered out, nothing was there. By morning, the air had cooled slightly, and the sun made the dew sparkle like tiny diamonds across the grass. I ate some trail mix for breakfast and decided to explore the other side of the lake. The trail there was narrower and overgrown, and the farther I walked, the quieter the forest became. Birds disappeared, insects were scarce, and the only sounds were my boots on the damp earth. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. A tree had fallen across the path recently, and the branches were freshly broken, almost as if something large had pushed through. My heart rate quickened. I had hiked this area many times, and I had never seen such fresh damage. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer, but the pattern seemed strange, almost like claws gouged the bark. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a natural accident or a fallen branch. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my skin crawl. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than intended. The trail I thought was familiar started to twist unnaturally, and I struggled to recognize landmarks. Panic began to creep in. I stopped to check my map, and my stomach sank. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and I was lost. The realization hit me harder than I expected. The forest that felt so familiar was now a maze. I tried retracing my steps, but quickly discovered the trails looked different from before. Trees that should have been landmarks were gone, replaced by dense undergrowth. The sunlight filtering through the canopy was dimmer here, and the air felt heavier, damp, and almost suffocating. My backpack felt heavier with each step. I called out, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the woods. No response came, just the echo of my own panic. Hours passed, and the sun began to drop behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, twisting and turning in strange shapes. I tried to stay calm, using my flashlight as a guide, but I quickly realized the batteries were running low. I had packed extra, but I had used them the previous night. Darkness was approaching faster than I had anticipated. I stumbled across a shallow ravine, the drop hidden by fallen leaves. My foot slipped, and I scraped my shin against a rock, sharp pain shooting up my leg. I ignored it, pressing on, my pulse racing. Night came faster than I expected. The forest transformed into an almost alien place. The sounds of nocturnal animals were everywhere, but one sound stood out. A low, heavy breathing that didn't match anything I had heard before came from behind me. My flashlight beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, and I felt trapped in the shadows. I moved cautiously, trying to keep my breathing steady, but every snap of a branch made my heart leap. I kept repeating to myself, stay calm, find the path, get to safety. Suddenly, I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting in the faint light. I froze. They were too low to be a human, too high to be a fox. They blinked, and I realized whatever it was large. Maybe a bear. My legs wanted to run, but I knew panicking would make things worse. I backed away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. The eyes followed me. The breathing grew louder, the heavy weight of the forest pressing in on me. I remembered the small emergency whistle I carried. I blew it hard. The sharp sound echoed through the trees. The eyes vanished instantly, leaving a suffocating silence behind. I waited, trembling, until I was sure it had gone. I didn't dare look around. Instead, I moved quickly in the opposite direction, slipping and tripping over roots and rocks, guided only by faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Hours passed and I walked blindly. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, and my leg throbbed from the earlier scrape. Just when despair was about to overtake me completely, I heard the faint sound of water. My heart leaped. I followed it, hoping it was the lake I had camped by. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the glint of moonlight on water. Relief washed over me in a wave so intense I almost cried. The lake was smaller than the one I had camped near, but it was a landmark I recognized. I didn't stop to think about how I got there. I just needed to rest. I collapsed near the shore, too exhausted to set up my tent properly. I pulled my sleeping bag over myself and lay on the damp ground, shivering from exhaustion and fear. The night stretched endlessly, each sound magnified in the dark. I kept my flashlight close, though I knew the batteries wouldn't last until morning. When dawn broke, the forest transformed again. The sun's rays cut through the canopy, warming the wet ground. I felt like I had been asleep for days. I looked around, trying to orient myself. By sheer luck, I recognized a trail leading back toward the main path. My legs were stiff and my movements slow, but adrenaline and relief kept me going. The forest, which had felt like a trap the night before, now seemed almost forgiving. Birds sang again, squirrels darted, and the rustle of leaves felt normal once more. I followed the trail for hours, stopping only to rest and drink water from my bottle. The forest gradually thinned, and by late afternoon, I stumbled onto the main road. My car was there, exactly where I had left it, as if it had been waiting for me. I climbed in, my body shaking from exhaustion. I didn't even care about the scratches, bruises, or the dirt covering me. I just needed to get home. Driving back, I kept replaying the previous night in my mind. The fear, the isolation, the unknown presence I couldn't identify. I realized how quickly comfort could turn into terror when you are alone and unprepared. When I finally reached my house, the normal sounds of the neighborhood felt surreal. Children playing, dogs barking, cars passing. All of it seemed overwhelmingly safe compared to the forest. I showered, cleaned my wounds, and sat quietly, staring out the window. I never went back to that hidden lake. The forest, which had once been a place of adventure, had become a place I respected and feared. That summer taught me a harsh lesson. The wilderness is unpredictable, and no amount of familiarity can make you immune to its dangers. From then on, I approached every hike with caution, respect, and preparation, knowing that one wrong step could turn the most peaceful adventure into a night of terror. Even now, every summer when the heat hits and the cicadas hum, I remember that night. The memory lingers, a constant reminder that the line between safety and It was the summer after my junior year of high school, and I had decided to take a solo trip to a small town by the lake. The idea of being alone in nature appealed to me. The thought of escaping the noise of the city and the endless chatter of my family felt like freedom. I wanted to camp, swim in the lake, hike through the woods, and just live in silence for a week. I had rented a small, rustic cabin through an online listing. The pictures looked cozy. Wooden walls, a small porch, a fire pit outside, and it was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, not too far from the lake. I had spent hours planning the trip, making lists of everything I might need, from food to a first aid kit, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a solid knife. The drive there was long. As I left the city behind, the air grew cleaner, and the smell of trees and damp earth replaced the exhaust fumes. Rolling hills and fields stretched on either side, and every mile brought me closer to the kind of quiet I craved. When I finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything in golden light. The cabin was even better than I expected. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the wood creaked under my feet, but it gave it character. Inside, the furniture was simple but sturdy, and there was a small kitchen with the basics. A stove, a sink, a few pots and pans. The bed looked soft, the sheets clean. I dropped my bags and opened the windows. The air smelled like pine and wet grass, and I could hear the distant lapping of water from the lake. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring the surroundings. The lake was only a 10-minute walk through a narrow path in the woods. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like glass. A few ducks floated near the edge, and I watched them for a while, just enjoying the silence. I set up a small fire pit near the cabin, thinking it would be perfect for the evenings. I stacked some wood I had brought and some I found lying around and lit a small fire. The smoke spiraled up, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the natural scent of the forest. Sitting there, I felt like I had stepped into a completely different world. That first night, I slept well, despite the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and occasionally, a distant animal moved in the underbrush. I was alert but not afraid. I had been camping before, and I knew the sounds of animals. What I didn't know was how unpredictable this summer would become. The next morning, I woke early, the sun filtering through the trees and into my cabin. I decided to hike around the area before swimming in the lake. I packed water, a small snack, and my knife just in case. The forest was dense, filled with towering trees and thick undergrowth. The trail I followed was faint at first, just a narrow path of crushed leaves, but soon it disappeared altogether. I didn't mind. I liked wandering off the beaten path. I was careful, though, marking my route with small piles of stones and broken branches so I could find my way back. I hiked for hours, discovering hidden clearings, old tree stumps, and a stream that I hadn't known existed. The water was crystal clear, flowing over smooth stones, and I stopped to drink from it. I felt alive, more present than I had in months. But as the day wore on, I realized that I had wandered far from the cabin. The sun was high, and shadows shifted, making the forest feel different. The paths looked unfamiliar, the trees all the same in their green density. A knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I reminded myself I had left markers. I retraced my steps slowly, checking each stone pile, each broken branch. It was during that hike that I noticed it, signs that someone else had been in the forest. At first, it was subtle. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch, a small fire pit with cold ashes that weren't there yesterday. Then I saw footprints in the soft soil near the stream. They weren't recent, but they were clear and human-sized. I paused, listening. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I felt watched, though I knew I was alone. My heart rate quickened. I told myself I was overreacting. People hiked these woods. There was probably a ranger, maybe another camper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I felt exhausted, more mentally than physically. I lit the fire again, hoping to relax. I cooked some simple food, bread with canned beans, and ate slowly, trying to calm my mind. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I kept imagining shadows moving just outside. I convinced myself it was all normal. The forest is alive after all. But the unease lingered. The following day, I decided to swim in the lake to shake off the anxiety. The water was cold at first, but I soon adjusted, floating on my back and staring at the sky. For a while, I felt peaceful again, letting the sun warm my face. But when I got out and walked along the shore, I saw it. Footprints leading toward the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, small, and booted, heading straight for my temporary home. My pulse quickened, and I froze, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a neighbor had wandered near, but the lake was remote, and I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. I ran back to the cabin, adrenaline surging. I locked the door, checked the windows, and stared at the surrounding forest, heart hammering. No one was there. No sound except the usual chirping of insects and the gentle lapping of the lake. I told myself to calm down, that I had likely imagined it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I stayed awake almost the entire time, sitting by the fire with a flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. The next morning, I planned to hike again, but with more caution. I carried my knife in my hand and kept an eye out for any signs of intruders. I noticed broken branches along the path I had marked the day before, stones moved from my markers, and more footprints, some overlapping mine. The realization hit me. Someone had been following me, possibly even tracking my movements deliberately. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to think clearly. I needed to get out of the forest to reach safety. I packed my things hastily, leaving some food behind. As I made my way back toward the lake, I felt eyes on me. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me freeze. I tried not to panic, but my pace quickened, my breathing shallow. I considered running, but I knew that could make things worse if someone was indeed following me. I kept to the open paths as much as possible, avoiding the thicker underbrush where someone could hide. When I finally reached the lake, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing on the opposite shore, partially hidden among the trees. They didn't move much, just watching me. My first instinct was to scream or run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that any sudden move could provoke them. I slowly backed away, keeping them in sight. Then I ran. I ran toward the main road that led out of the forest, my heart pounding, my legs burning. I didn't look back. I reached the road, which was empty. I followed it for what felt like miles until I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed. I jumped in without explanation, my body shaking uncontrollably. I told them my location, and they agreed to take me to the nearest town. On the way, I kept glancing at the forest. There was no sign of the figure. It was as if they had vanished, melting back into the trees. I spent the rest of the summer in the town, staying at a motel instead of returning to the cabin. I reported what I had seen to the local authorities. They told me that while there had been some reports of trespassers and illegal camping, nothing concrete had come up in that area. They advised me not to return to the cabin. The feeling of being watched never left me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the footprints, the broken markers, the figure across the lake. Eventually, I returned home, grateful to be back in the city with people around. The freedom I had sought in the forest had turned into a constant sense of vulnerability and fear. I realized that nature could be beautiful and peaceful, but it could also be unpredictable and unforgiving when humans with unknown intentions are involved. That summer taught me a lesson I would never forget, that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They are other people, lurking quietly, watching, waiting. Even now, years later, I think about that cabin, that lake, and the forest, and I feel a chill remembering how small and exposed I felt. I never returned, and I never will. The thought of being alone in those woods, not knowing who else is there, is more terrifying than any horror story I've ever read. That summer vacation, meant to be the highlight of my life, became a memory of caution and vigilance, a reminder that danger can hide in the most peaceful places. Summer had always been my favorite season. The air felt warm and alive, and the world seemed to open up with endless possibilities. That year, I decided to take a solo vacation. A week in the countryside, away from the city's noise and the constant buzz of people. I had rented a small cabin that sat near a forest edge, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles, a narrow dirt road connecting it to the main highway. The cabin looked isolated in pictures, but I liked that. I wanted silence, space, a chance to disappear for a while. What I didn't expect was how quickly that sense of isolation would shift into something far heavier, far more suffocating than I had imagined. The first day was perfect. I drove the winding road from the highway, passing tall cornfields and scattered farmhouses that seemed almost forgotten. The air smelled like hot grass and wildflowers, a mix I hadn't smelled since childhood summers in my grandmother's village. When I arrived at the cabin, it was exactly as the listing had promised. A small, sturdy wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by a thin line of trees that separated it from the wide open fields. I parked my car and unloaded my bags, noticing the silence around me. There were no birds, no insects buzzing loudly, no signs of people. The wind whispered through the trees, and I told myself that was normal for somewhere so rural. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen, a table, a couch, and a single bedroom. Everything was clean, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and pine. I unpacked slowly, feeling a strange relief to be alone. My first night, I lit a few candles and read a book by the window. Outside, the darkness seemed complete. The kind of darkness where you cannot even make out shapes, just a dense black that pressed against the glass. I went to bed early, tired from the drive, and slept deeply. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds, faint but clear. I brewed coffee and walked around the surrounding fields. There was a small dirt path leading into the forest, and I decided to explore it. First, it was relaxing. The sun filtered through the trees, the forest floor covered in dry leaves, small ferns, and wild mushrooms. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, I guessed maybe raccoons. The air smelled damp but clean, earthy, alive. I kept walking, deeper than I had planned. The path narrowed, the trees thicker, and the sounds of the outside world faded. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the sunlight hit the ground in golden patches. I paused to take pictures, feeling a thrill at how untouched it all felt. That's when I heard it, a faint snapping sound. It was subtle, like a twig breaking under a footstep, but it didn't fit with the sounds of the forest around me. I stopped, scanning the clearing, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal. The forest was full of them. I turned back toward the cabin, but then another sound, footsteps. Not in the leaves, but on the dry forest floor, heavier, deliberate. I froze. The sound moved around me in the trees, circling, slow. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker, maybe a hunter, but something about it didn't feel right. I quickened my pace, moving faster along the path. The footsteps didn't speed up, didn't follow my pace exactly. They just shifted as I moved, always nearby. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I was sweating, my hands trembling as I unlocked the cabin door. Inside, I checked the locks and windows. Nothing seemed out of place. I sat on the couch, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I was imagining things, that being alone made every sound seem louder, more threatening. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Every crack in the wood, every gust of wind through the trees sounded like someone, or something, moving outside. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a shadow, a figure, anything. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I unpacked my hiking gear but didn't go far. I explored the fields instead, walking the edges where the tall grass bent under the wind. I felt exposed in the open, but somehow safer, visible. That's when I noticed it. Tracks in the soft earth near the cabin. They were large, too large for a human, deep impressions that sank several inches into the dirt. I crouched to look closer and realized they weren't from an animal either. Not exactly. Too symmetrical, too deliberate. My stomach sank. I tried to convince myself it was someone else's work, maybe a farmer from nearby, but the cabin was several hundred meters from any other property. The sense of being watched grew heavier with each passing hour. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I saw movement in the trees near the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it wasn't. It moved upright, slowly, deliberately. I ducked behind the porch railing, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loud. Then it stopped, as if sensing me. I didn't dare look directly at it, just froze until it eventually vanished into the shadows. I spent the next 2 days inside the cabin. I avoided the forest entirely, only stepping outside when the sun was high. I boarded up windows with spare wood I found in the shed, stacked chairs against the doors, and slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Each night, the forest seemed closer, darker, the shadows more alive. The snapping of twigs, rustling of leaves, heavy footsteps that stopped whenever I looked outside. They all made my stomach churn with dread. By the fourth day, I realized I couldn't stay. The thought of spending another night alone in that cabin with whoever or whatever was out there terrified me. I packed my things, but then I saw the tracks again. This time they led from the edge of the forest directly to my porch. I froze, imagining what could have left them. I didn't care if it was a person or something else. I just wanted out. I decided to leave before nightfall. I started the car and drove toward the highway. The road seemed longer than before, the forest on either side darker, more menacing. Every so often, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. Shadows slipping between trees, fast and deliberate. I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I dared, heart racing, until I finally reached a small gas station at the highway intersection. I parked and sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Someone was following me in the woods, but I didn't see them. I didn't want to sound crazy. After a few hours, I found a motel in the next town. I booked a room for the night and slept fitfully, constantly checking the windows. I didn't leave until morning, and I never went back to that cabin. When I finally returned home, I looked up the area online. Locals mentioned disappearances over the years, hikers who went into that forest and never returned. Nothing official, nothing reported widely, just stories whispered among those who lived nearby. I never figured out exactly what was following me. Maybe it was a person, maybe someone living in the forest, maybe something else. I'll never know for certain, but that summer vacation taught me something I can't forget. Isolation is a dangerous thing. Silence can hide more than peace, and the beauty of nature can conceal threats that no amount of preparation can fully reveal. Even now, years later, I still remember the way the shadows moved in that forest, the sound of deliberate footsteps circling me, the deep, heavy tracks pressed into the earth near my cabin. I never returned to the countryside. I avoid remote places entirely, the fear of being watched too strong, too real. I tell people it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know that's not true. Something was there and it saw me, and for whatever reason, it let me leave. I don't know why I survived, and that uncertainty is worse than anything else. Because if I ever return, I might not be so lucky. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. The year had been grueling, long hours of school, exams and chores, and the thought of escaping to a small town in the mountains felt like a relief I could almost touch. My parents had rented a cabin near the edge of the forest, not far from a river that twisted through the valley like a silver ribbon. The pictures online made it seem almost perfect. Tall pine trees, a small clearing where you could set up a fire, a porch that overlooked the river. I imagined waking up to the smell of fresh pine, the sun bouncing off the water, and nothing but the sound of birds for hours on end. What I didn't anticipate was how heavy the silence could feel once I was there alone. We arrived on a late Friday afternoon. The drive itself had been long and winding, with roads narrowing as the mountains rose higher around us. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already low, streaking the sky with orange and pink. My parents unpacked the car while I wandered to the edge of the forest. The air was cooler under the canopy, earthy and damp, and the forest smelled of moss and pine needles. I loved the smell, the way it seemed to sink into my clothes, my hair, and even my skin. There was a small trail leading deeper into the trees, uneven with roots poking through the soil. I followed it for a few minutes, imagining myself discovering something exciting or hidden, but I stopped when the shadows lengthened. The woods felt quiet, too quiet, and not in a peaceful way. There was a stillness that pressed against my ears, like the forest was holding its breath. The first night was strange. The cabin was old, wooden, creaking with every gust of wind, every shift in temperature. I could hear the boards settling and the river outside, low and gurgling over stones. But there was another sound too, subtle at first, that made my stomach tighten. It was a scraping noise, soft and deliberate, almost like something large moving against the trees. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. We had been warned about bears in the area, but I didn't think much of it, and sleep finally came, though fitfully. The next day, I decided to explore. I left my parents to settle in and took a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and my phone, even though the reception was terrible. I found a narrow path along the river, stones slippery with moss. The sunlight hit the water in bright streaks, and for a moment I felt safe, almost joyous. I moved carefully, testing each stone before stepping. As I followed the river upstream, I noticed broken branches, flattened grass, and signs of movement that didn't quite fit with normal wildlife. A branch snapped behind me. I froze, scanning the dense trees. Nothing moved, but my heart pounded hard in my chest. I told myself it was just a rabbit or a bird. Still, I quickened my pace, feeling like the forest had changed around me while I wasn't paying attention. It was harder to breathe, the air thicker, and the light seemed to fade more quickly under the trees than it should have. By mid-afternoon, I had walked farther than I expected. The path became less clear, almost disappearing entirely in some spots. I stepped over roots and rocks, the forest growing denser, darker. Then I heard it, a low growl, guttural and not far off. I froze, my stomach dropping. I scanned the trees, and in a small clearing, I caught sight of a dark shape moving through the underbrush. My first thought was a bear, but the shape was smaller, closer to human proportions, though hunched strangely. Panic hit me, and I turned back the way I came. I moved fast now, stumbling over roots, heart hammering, every noise magnified. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate, not like an animal. I didn't dare look back. I ran, not caring about the path, slipping and scraping my legs and hands on the undergrowth. I didn't stop until I burst back onto the wider trail near the cabin, chest heaving, trembling with adrenaline. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me tense. I heard movement around the perimeter, small branches snapping, but when I looked, nothing was there. The next morning, I noticed something chilling. My bag from the river trail was moved slightly, the straps tugged as if someone or something had examined it. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe a deer, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something had followed me back, something that knew the area, that could move silently and deliberately. I wanted to tell my parents, but they were busy with chores and unpacking, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I became hyper-aware. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but the curiosity and the need to explore drew me back into the forest. I took a different trail, one that led to a small clearing with a broken-down wooden shed. The shed looked abandoned, but there were signs someone or something had been there recently. Footprints, trampled grass, a faint smell, like smoke mixed with wet earth. I lingered at the edge of the clearing, flashlight ready. That's when I saw them. Faint impressions of a figure in the mud, hunched over, the way the sunlight caught on a patch of hair or fur. It moved quickly, disappearing behind a tree before I could react. I knew then that the thing following me wasn't random. It was studying me, watching me, learning my habits. By the 4th day, I stopped going far at all. I stayed on the cabin porch, reading or sketching in my notebook, the forest looming just beyond the clearing. I could feel eyes on me whenever I looked at the trees. One evening, while the sun was low and the sky was painted in fading orange, I noticed something horrifying. There were deep claw marks on the cabin door, long, deliberate, as if whatever had been watching me wanted to make sure I knew it could reach me. My stomach turned cold. I checked the locks, reinforced the windows with whatever boards I could find. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed alive. I had to be ready. The 5th day, I noticed the food had been disturbed. Not eaten, no, that would have been a bear or a raccoon, but moved, shifted. My peanut butter jar wasn't where I had left it, the bag of bread slightly open. Someone or something was inside the perimeter. I couldn't call for help, There was barely any signal. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the emergency kit in the cabin. I packed it discreetly, grabbing water, canned food, a small hatchet, and my flashlight. Then I made a plan. If it came closer, I would retreat to the shed by the river, where I could climb up into the rafters for safety. I spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I put pots on the windowsills, noisemakers along the clearing, anything that might give me a warning. Night came and it was worse than before. The scratching and footsteps were louder, closer. I stayed in the corner of the main room, heart hammering, eyes darting between the darkened windows. Then something slammed against the door. Wood cracked. I grabbed the hatchet and waited, trying to steady my breathing. Came again, harder. The cabin shook under the force. I realized it wasn't an animal, it was too intelligent, too deliberate. Whatever it was, it wanted inside, wanted to confront me. Fear froze me, but I forced myself to move. I slipped out the back door, running into the night, heart in my throat, sprinting toward the river shed. My feet tore through roots and underbrush, branches hitting my face and arms. I didn't look back, but I could hear it following, slower now, careful, stalking. I reached the shed, climbed the small ladder to the loft inside, and held my breath. Outside, I heard the thing circling, sniffing, scratching at the walls, testing my hiding spot. Hours passed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe louder than necessary. At dawn, the sound stopped. I waited until the sun fully rose before climbing down. The forest seemed almost empty now, the oppressive tension gone. It hadn't followed me beyond the clearing. Whatever it was, it stayed within its territory. The next morning, I packed everything I could carry, leaving nothing behind. I walked back to the main road, careful, scanning every tree line. My parents had started to worry, and their relief when they saw me was immense. I didn't tell them everything, not the full truth. They assumed I had explored too far and gotten spooked by wildlife. But I knew better. I had learned something vital. The forest wasn't a backdrop for a vacation. It was alive in a way that didn't care about me, a presence that could stalk silently, deliberately. As we drove away, I glanced back once at the distant trees, tall and unyielding, shadows moving among the trunks. I felt a shiver, a mix of relief and lingering fear. The cabin remained, untouched by humans, but not empty. Something had claimed it, and it would always be waiting. That summer vacation had been beautiful in sunlight, but it had shown me a truth I couldn't unsee. Wilderness is not tame, and sometimes curiosity